From the City of Angels off the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Noory. Welcome to Coast to Coast AM. Emerging Artist Night tonight. Info at coasttocoastam.com. And next hour, are we headed for World War III? Author David Hagberg joins us. Let's find out what he has to say. Well, residents in Oklahoma over the weekend are shaken after the state's strongest earthquake ever and big aftershocks. Saturday night's magnitude 5.6 earthquake was centered near Sparks. That's 44 miles northeast of Oklahoma City. It was followed early Sunday by a 4.0 aftershock. A number of homes damaged in that situation. Mitch Batras, EarthChangesMedia.com, has been doing some research on the matter. How many swarms of earthquakes in Oklahoma lately?
I think they're over 10, and that's registering over a 2.5 or higher. There's several more than that. I saw one report saying there were somewhere around 1,000 if you were considering, the ones and 1-2s.
The little ones,
going on for sometimes. But yes, this is definitely a significant event. All eyes are on. This is one of those places where many people thought that Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, some of the surrounding areas were, quote, safe zones. But that's not the case.
There's no safe zones, Mitch.
There really is no safe zone. That's correct, George. That question is brought to me, still a dozen or so times a week. And really my answer, it is not where you live. It's not the geographical area that should be the utmost importance. It's part of the play, but that's not the confirming factor. It's who you live with and around that will make the huge difference. Just a few days ago with the solar flares up or the extreme weather they were having in the Northeast, we found that out rather quickly. The emergency police department, fire department, the search and rescue, Red Cross, they couldn't get to these millions of folks to stay warm,
That's right.
that their needs were met. It took their neighbors. And we saw it again in 1989. And it's that kind of thing that we need to start thinking about.
Mitch, this 5.6 was felt as far away as what, Wisconsin?
That's right. And there really are some similarities to the New Madrid Fault. That is Oklahoma. That part of Oklahoma is within the New Madrid range. Now, of course, what's unique to this one is the epicenter itself, which is very rare in and of itself, is in Oklahoma. And that hadn't been seen for maybe just short of 100 years. However, it's been over 200 years since Oklahoma has experienced anything like this, not only in the magnitude of the quakes, but this ongoing swarm that's occurring. And some of them are still in the 3s and 4s.
Well, I got to tell you, Mitch, these earth changes, truly unbelievable. Thank you so much. A story we've been following here at coasttocoastam.com, a huge asteroid will pass closer to Earth than the moon on Tuesday, giving scientists a very rare chance for study without having to go through the time and expense of launching a probe. Earth's close encounter with asteroid 2005 YU-55 will occur at 6:28 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The space rock sails about 200,000 miles from the planet. Now, tomorrow night in our first hour, planetary scientist Daniel Durda joins us to talk about the potential danger of this asteroid or others that could get very close to planet Earth. Israeli President Shimon Peres has warned that an attack on Iran is becoming increasingly likely days before a report by the UN's nuclear watchdog on Iran's nuclear program is due. In France, meanwhile, the French foreign minister says, and he warns that an attack on Iran would be disastrous. Meanwhile, in Greece, the Greek prime minister will step down as his government's leader. The country's president made this announcement. He was agreeing to do so on the condition that the controversial $130 billion euro bailout deal is approved. That's kind of novel, isn't it? If you get a bailout like that, the leaders just resign and step down. I wonder if we should learn something from that. Greg Hunter, USAWatchdog.com. First of all, Greg, let's turn to this Iranian situation. I talked to a couple people today from Iran. They don't think an attack is imminent. they think this is just PR rhetoric. What do you think?
Listen, the International Atomic Energy Agency says that Iran is on the brink, on the threshold of nuclear capability. And, you know, if you take a look at the background of this, the Israelis have been working on a new missile that can go up more than 1,000 miles. That's a distance from Israel to Iran. The problem before is trying to fly a plane over, refueling, all that, flying back. It's a more than 2,000-mile round trip. Well, they have a missile that can hit them. Iran has sold, or China has sold Iran missiles as well. So this is kind of heating up, and I don't think they're playing games. I think if Sharon Peres is saying, warning about an attack, and they've been bracing for one, there have been reports in the UK about the same thing about a week ago. This is not, they're not doing this for fun. It's scary, and of course it has huge financial implications. And if Iran is attacked, of course the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain would be attacked. It's an act of war to the United States to fire on a U.S. naval ship. The Straits of Hormuz, which is in the south of Iran, will also be closed down, with 30 or 40% of the world's oil goes through there. Oil prices spike. The economy tumbles into even worse the depression that it's already in.
When's the last time, though, a leader of a country made an announcement prior to the attack by saying that it's becoming increasingly likely?
I think they float trial balloons all the time, and I think they're floating a trial balloon to see who says what and who will react. I mean, there'd be a big implications with China. China refines, Iran's raw crude oil and ships it back to them in gasoline and things like that. I almost said Soviets. The Russians, are in big business helping Iran build their nuclear facilities. So this could be a really ugly situation. It could throw the world into a big war right away if this happens. So we'll see. In an election year, you would think that would be the last thing that Barack Obama would want to see, but stranger things have happened. The entire European debt crisis situation, it will continue to be a roller coaster. One of the things they floated at the G20, and now we're getting down to the brass tacks. They wanted Germany, which is the world's second largest holder of gold, to back this bailout fund, the EFSF, the European Financial
They're not going to do
Facility.
that.
They got 3,400 tons of gold. But here's the other thing, and now it's getting down to, they're going to back something with real money, with real store of value, real collateral. Italy is the third largest country a holder of gold. It's actually fourth if you include the IMF. They have 2,400 tons of gold, and Spain is like 19 on the list. They have 280 tons of gold. Now, Spain and Italy, the reason why I bring them up, they have $3.4 trillion in this sovereign debt. And they may be asking Spain and Italy to come up with some collateral when they need to be bailed out, because they will. And I don't think the Greek situation, they supposedly going to cut a deal. Ultimately, they want even more cuts than they've already had over in Greece. They've had riots and protests. And I think no referendum, and I still think the country will get a referendum one way or the other. And protests in the streets are a nice, neat one by vote. But I don't think they will ultimately make their commitments, and I think they will default, just like I think Italy and Spain will default. But the thing is, will Italy have to put up its gold?
Well, and let me ask you this. An American listening to this program right now, or a Canadian, they're probably saying, what do I care about Greece?
You care about Greece because the banks are interconnected in this daisy chain of credit default swaps and debt and leverage. MF Global, which is in the U.S., I thought European banks would go down, and that's the big untold story. Here's why you should care. Because what they're not telling you in the mainstream media is that there are going to be many bank defaults before this is all over in Europe. And also in the United States, there are going to be bank defaults. MF Global isn't a bank, but it's a primary dealer in treasuries, and that's one of, now there's only 21 dealers left, which brings you to the question of this. If the Federal Reserve, which is the regulator of record when you are a primary dealer, how bad are the other primary dealers? How much leverage do they have? MF Global, 40 to 1 leverage. Some of these other big banks with all these big leverage positions like Bank of America, like JP Morgan Chase, some of the biggest banks in America have something like almost 50 to 1 leverage, and they have all kinds of stuff, and they do have exposure to sovereign debt. So what does somebody over here in the U.S., what would they think about? In the U.S., well, they would think about how much money are they going to print to have to stave this off, or are they going to get out of control, and are they going to basically have bank failures over here in a big way? That's the wild card. Ultimately, I think you got to count on, this is what I first said when I came on your show, George, and that was count on inflation. And what do we have? Some pretty big inflation.
You got it. Thanks. Greg Hunter, his website, usawatchdog.com. I'll always remember the late Howard Cosell broadcasting the battle between George Foreman and Joe Frazier, when Foreman just pelted Frazier, and Cosell would scream, "Down goes Frazier." Remember that? Well, legendary boxer Joe Frazier is hoping he can achieve the biggest knockout of his life, beating liver cancer. The 67-year-old champion, who was diagnosed a month ago, is now under hospice care. Although Frazier is a former heavyweight champion, he is best known for being the first man to beat Muhammad Ali, which happened during the fight of the century at Madison Square Garden in 1971. Singer Andy Williams, he has bladder cancer. It's undergoing treatment, plans to return to performing next year. The singer told fans at a concert in Branson, Missouri, Saturday night that he has cancer. Andy Williams is 83 years old. He shared the news during his Christmas show at the Moon River Theater, which he created in 1992. In Miami, a woman found her father dead inside his home with 60,000 bees hovering around. They were in the walls. The man's daughter found him in the upstairs bedroom of the home. The man was renovating the house, which neighbors had said had been in the family for decades. The cause of death not immediately determined. I would say he probably got stung to death. And how is it that the ancient civilizations were able to maintain their cultures in perfect equilibrium for thousands of years, but ours all screwed up within just a few decades? Up next, Freddy Silva joins us. We'll talk about that on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Noory. This hour we talk about Legacy of the Gods. Freddy Silva, one of the world's leading researchers of places of power, ancient systems of knowledge, and the interaction between temples and consciousness, and he lectures worldwide with keynote presentations at the International Science and Consciousness Conference, among others. Here he is back on Coast to Coast. Freddie, it's been a while. How are you?
It has been indeed, George. Nice to be back.
Good to have you here, and nice job with Legacy of the Gods. It's updated now. You, of course, the best-selling author of Secrets in the Fields. Tell me a little bit about some of the research that went into these sacred sites.
Most of it just walking on my own two legs and spending about 2 decades notes and experiences. I mean, that's the best way to do it, really. It was, my passion for sacred sites has been there since the early years. I mean, I grew up in my country where I was born with very, very old sacred sites. This was in Portugal. We have some of the oldest places in Europe. And then I moved to England, and, of course, we have a lot of them there as well. And, of course, here in America. And after I spent a little detour researching crop circles and getting that book out of the way,
right,
I suddenly realized that the crop circles shared such a huge connection to the ancient sacred sites in terms of the way that they share the same magnetic hotspots. They're built in the same geometry, and they're always beside each other. So I started to sort of have a bit more time on my hands to go around looking at these places, and just began to research them one by one, and just looking back at my notes and realized that they really are built as a huge sort of insurance policy, and they've been built to last, to survive into our time, and that's what got my attention, that suddenly these things are coming to the forefront of our consciousness, just as our societies begin to fall apart yet again.
Freddie, how much science is behind some of these sacred sites, and how did the ancients even know about this?
Well, that's a huge question. Science actually has been doing a lot of work on it. For example, there was a big study in Britain in the 1980s where they actually, a bunch of scientists got a whole bunch of magnetometers together, and they went around some of the stone circles taking readings, and they were amazed as to the things that they found. And in the book, I actually have one of the photographs of one of the stone circles, which shows very clearly that at the entrance to the stone circle, the local magnetic field, what is usually called the serpent lines of the Earth, this magnetic line runs through the entrance and then gets condensed inside the stones and actually creates a sort of a whirlpool effect right down to the center of the stone circle. And they repeated this experiment again and again. They found that all of these places, without exception, are drawing from the local magnetic field and corralling this energy inside their space. So not surprisingly, they realized that people were having unusual experiences inside them. And they also found that wherever they exist in the world, that all of the sacred sites, again, without exception, they are placed on these hotspots that they called, and you have to remember this one, conductivity discontinuity. And they basically are places where the geomagnetic field of the Earth then interacts with the telluric currents that flow across the face of the Earth. And when the two intersect, there's a certain concentrated electromagnetic field that influences the body's own energy field, and that's what stimulates our states of consciousness inside these places. And people like the Sioux in the Central Plains have a much easier way of recognizing these things. They just call them scan, and they talk about them doing exactly the same thing. And then some other experiments were done by Princeton University, of all people. And what they did was they went off to the Middle East and in Egypt and also here in North America. And they found that by measuring the background frequency of some of these sacred sites and then comparing them to, say, meditational groups and how the influx of consciousness is also measured at these places, and comparing them to, let's say, people meditating at at a car park at Walmart, for example, they found that a meditational group obviously had a certain frequency that would interact with the local sites. But when the scientists went around walking with these portable computers in their pocket around the Egyptian temples, they found that the temples just by themselves were giving away a huge amount of energy that was stored there for thousands of years, and that probably what contributed to the stimulation of the local energy field and why people were having such unusual shamanic experiences in them.
Interesting. Do you think that these temples and these structures have something within it, some kind of mechanism, or is it because of where they were put and how they were built that gives them that ability?
All of the above. They all occupy magnetic hotspots to begin with, and that even goes for all the sacred mountains around the world, which is very unusual. How did they know that in the first place? But what the Russians found, for example, in the 1950s, is that when you actually take this energy and you give it shape and you put it within a certain geometric shape, it will do unusual things to your brain. So it's the combination of the way the energy is corralled into these places. The Egyptians used to call it harnessing the enemy snake, referring to these telluric lines of energy that flow through the Earth, and sometimes the energy itself, because of the way it corresponds to the effects of sunspot activity, it can actually do detrimental things to the landscape and to people. So once they anchored that to the spot by basically taking a lot of rock, which of course the rock is full of quartz, which is a piezoelectric material, by working this energy and acupuncturing it to the spot and then making the temple designed in a certain geometric manner, they're able to control it in a very fine way. And this is why when you go to different temples, let's say in Egypt, each one of them does different things, and there are myths associated with each one. And when you look at the inherent geometry of the way that the different parts of the temples are put together, you suddenly realize that they were right, that the shape of the building does have an effect on your state of awareness. And that's what the Russians found when they began to strap people with EEG devices to their heads in Gothic cathedrals in Europe. They found that the brain waves of people in these buildings went up by as much as 4,000% above normal waking state.
What baffles me, though, Freddie, is how the ancient people would be able to comprehend this.
That's what I'd like to know.
I mean, my God, somebody must have taught them something.
It's if you look at a lot of the ancient texts, for example, the Puranas of the Indians, and also the Egyptian building texts, and you find the same commonalities between these texts. They keep talking about a time before a massive global deluge struck the earth and wiped out what they called cities of knowledge. And these cities of knowledge, which have now been found thanks in part to the myths that have been written down, and also by people like Graham Hancock, who actually went down and dived off the coast of India and found that there are indeed enormous cities 120 feet below sea level.
Hold on, Freddie. We're going to come right back. We're going to hit this break, and I want to talk more with you about your work, Legacy of the Gods. And our special guest this hour, Freddy Silva. We're going to be coming back, talking to him about Legacy of the Gods. We'll also take your phone calls with him as well. Hey, by the way, as you know, my personal goal, 2,000 new Coast Insiders, members of the club each month. We signed up 2,500 in October, and we're on our way here in November. All you have to do is go to coasttocoastam.com, and you can register. It costs less than 25 cents a day. Nathan, do you have a quarter? Flip one over to me. All right, that's it. Just less than 25 cents a day. A parking meter. There you go. We'll be back in a moment with phone calls and Freddy Silva on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, Freddy Silva, our guest, as we talk about the legacy of the gods. Freddy, this altered state of consciousness that the people would get into because of these temples, these facilities, was it a tone that was being emitted, or what would happen to them physically?
The temples around the world, they have these inscriptions that talk about the places as being fundamental to transforming a person into a god, into a bright star. And I don't think it was so much a physiological change as it was a state of mind. And having been to a lot of these places, I think I can understand what they were trying to say. I've read a lot of people's accounts of what happened to them in these places, and my own experiences of seeing things there pretty much tell me that the whole purpose is to have a shamanic experience whereby for a few minutes, or if you were able to stand it for a few hours, you're able to release yourself from your body. In other words, part of your soul or your subconscious is able to transcend the physical world and somehow connect with an astral reference library. And it very much depends on what it is that you take into these places, the questions that you take in with you. The answers are going to be very specific to each individual person. So no two people will have the same experience. And the whole purpose was to basically find out from this reference library to get information that will help you live your life much more purposefully in this world. So in other words, once you have the access to the knowledge of what they call the knowledge of the gods, they talked about how you can use this knowledge in a degree of ways here on Earth, in practical ways, to bring about self-empowerment. Because as we all know, the more knowledge you have at your disposal, the less you are subservient to somebody else who's trying to control you. And it might seem very cliche, but it really was that simple. It was about taking a certain degree of control of your own life through a process of self-realization, which allows you to have a degree of conscious control over the way you live. And they basically talked about how you basically live your life much more fully aware. And this has been the primary motivation behind most of the mystery schools, all the way to the Freemasons for thousands of years.
We need this now for people on the planet. You know what?
Exactly. And that was my whole purpose for getting this whole project underway, because it suddenly dawned on me that these places were built to last into our time. I mean, you go to Egypt, you go to even in New Mexico, where we have the navels of the earth called Shiprock, one of the oldest sites, which is sacred to the Anasazi. These places are not going anywhere anytime soon, and they were built to remind us of a time when we were much more connected on a bigger scheme, not just to the earth and nature, but to the whole cosmos. I mean, these places also measure the movements of the skies. And it's funny how so many of the amount of temples that we have around the world were built at specific periods, always preceding catastrophes or sea level rises or meteor strikes. And it's the same thing with the Gothic cathedrals. When we had the last building periods in Europe of sacred sites, those preceded a mini ice age as a result of a meteorite strike that hit, I believe, it was off the coast of Ireland. We had a miniature ice age for several hundred years. So these places were literally built as an insurance policy to last into our time, so that when these people, I call them advanced people, initiates, adepts, some people call them gods, I think they had the foresight to realize that we as a culture would lose the plot at some time in the late 20th century, and we'd need these places to go back to find a moment in time where we can just disconnect from the material world, from the left brain thinking, and get into that receptive state where we can just figure out why we're doing here. And I believe part of the reason why the crop circles are happening now, they are filling in a gap in that temple building process because we haven't really built temples en masse for several hundred years. I think that the crop circles, the reason why they're appearing now, because they so mimic the way that the old temples used to behave, including the physiological effects, are also part of that process. And there's no doubt that we are now experiencing a major change in the weather, in the cycles of nature. And so it's funny that these things are appearing at the same time, also built on the same principles of temple making.
Freddie, I'm going to ask you about some angles in a moment. Let's go to Joanne in San Luis Obispo, California. Hi, Joanne. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Hi, George. So I'm happy to be on your show for the first time. I'm a big fan of listening to Coast to Coast.
Well, I'm glad you're with us. Sounds like you have a concert going on in the background.
Oh, my gosh. My husband has a TV on. I'm trying to go in an area in the house where it's quiet.
All right.
I just wanted to say something that I had an experience with my husband back in 1997. We were married, and we visited the Yucatan Peninsula on our honeymoon, and we had the opportunity to visit Chichen Itza, and it was an awesome experience, and walking around the whole, the temples and all the Mayan ancient ruins are still there. But when we climbed up the Great Pyramid of where I think Quetzalcoatl was, and every spring equinox, March 30 or 21st, they have the sun, and it has the serpent shadow cast down on the stairs. But anyway, when we climbed up on top of the major temple, and it was extremle tall and an arduous up journey, and they're all limestone. And when we were up there, I had a metaphysical experience.
You felt something?
Oh, I certainly did. And I saw these other people grouped in a circle, and it was dark and cooler once you got up on the top. And they were kind of like chanting in prayer, and I think they might have been locals because they were smaller, and they might have been Mayan people.
Well, let's ask Freddie about the power of places like that. Freddie, are these the spots you're talking about too?
Absolutely, and in fact, it reminds me of an experience that I had with 3 colleagues of mine in the Great Pyramid, where we were doing some sound work, and the lights went off. And anybody that's been to the Great Pyramid knows that you have to pay a lot of backsheesh to get the lights off inside the Great Pyramid, let alone remove all the people from it. So there were just 4 of us in the King's Chamber. The lights went off, and for 20 minutes we had the place to ourselves in total darkness. I mean, you can't even see your fingers in front of your face. And we were doing some sound work in there, and as God is my witness, I actually saw in total darkness a group of people actually come out of the rock of the King's Chamber. They were about 9 feet tall. They were sort of dressed in sort of white satin. And it's as if these priests just came out of the stones, surrounded us in a circle. And after 20 minutes, it was a beautiful experience. I mean, it's changed my life forever.
Sure.
One of many. And when the lights came on, I looked at the other guys, and it's clear that we wanted to say something to each other, but we weren't sure what to say. We walked down in silence. We left the building totally dazed, and I said to one of the guys, I said, "Did you see what I saw?" And he said, "You mean all the guys just came out of the rocks, like the priests came out of the stones and surrounded us in a big circle, and they were really tall?" And I said, "You really saw that?" I said, "Absolutely." And all 4 of us saw the same thing at the same time. And I did some research on this, and of course the famous story of Napoleon came to mind. He was left in the Great Pyramid when he invaded Egypt, and when they opened the door in the morning and let him out, he ran out like a banshee, and right up to his deathbed, he would not reveal what happened to him inside the Great Pyramid.
Wow.
And, I spoke to some friends of mine about this experience, and the book came out, and they called me up and they said, and one of them's a sound engineer, and he said, I did some sound work in the Great Pyramid as well, and I saw the same people come out of the same stones in the king's chamber. Now, we couldn't make that stuff up, and this guy is very level-headed, as am I.
Did it frighten them or enlighten them?
Oh, it was a very enlightening experience. It was humbling. The only way I can describe it is a sense of total unconditional love. It's as if you're being actually protected, and I'll never forget it to this day. And in fact, I went to my bookshelf. I have a big library of books, as you probably imagine. And I had the book that was called In Ancient Egypt by Paul Brunton, an incredible man from the Victorian era. And he actually went to the Great Pyramids, had a bit of an experience there himself, and I was amazed to learn that in the 1920s, he had exactly the same experience, and he was actually in there for several hours, and he described the same priests coming out of the same stones in the same way that I did in my book, and I hadn't read the book before. So we're talking about different people having exactly the same experience at these sites, and it's one of many. I mean, like I said, the experience depends on what it is that you take in there. I mean, in many cases, in terms of research and writing, I have colleagues of mine who spend many times.
And let me ask you this, Freddie, if I can, you talked about an angle, a mathematical angle that was discovered. What's its purpose? What happened with it?
Well, the story goes back to the crop circles. I found this angle quite by accident, although probably by.
Hey, Freddie, we're gonna have to call you back because your line is a little screwed up. We've got just a few minutes to go, and we've got to call you right back. But let's go to Barb in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Go ahead, Barb.
Yes, George. We've been trying to figure out. Somebody had said that those sites where all the lines come together are chakras.
The ley lines, yeah.
Yeah, and the geomagnetic fields like he was talking about, but some are positive and some are negative. Like I believe Hawaii is positive, but somebody, I don't know if it's Greg Braden, has said certain sites are like the crown and the third eye, and Stonehenge is something else of the earth. Can he answer that later?
Well, I've got to tell you, are you familiar with the Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida? We've talked about it before.
Right. Yeah.
That little Edward Leeds Scullin put it together, and it is on ley lines there too. And Freddie, did your research come up with anything about these specific ley lines and how they can emit this kind of energy?
Not the ley lines. The ley lines are geometric alignments from point A to point B. But the energy lines are basically the serpent lines or the telluric currents. But I didn't hear the first part of the question, though.
Yeah, she just basically wanted to know about these ley lines and what kind of mystical powers they might have.
Well, okay. As I said before, the ley lines and the energy lines are two different things. Ley lines are geometric alignments between sites. They don't actually have any energy by themselves. All the sacred sites on the face of the earth, without exception, including the sacred mountains, are all aligned on the crossing paths of the earth's telluric currents. That is, the magnetic lines of energy that flow across the earth, just like you and I have veins and arteries in our body, so that the earth has its own magnetic grid as well. And the reason why the ancients sourced these hot spots was because they have a direct influence physiologically on your body. For example, the magnetism that you're standing on in these energy spots means that they're going to start moving all the iron that flows through the blood of the human body. And you remember that experiment at school where you take a piece of paper, you drop some iron filings?
I love that experiment.
Yeah, and it's basically you're standing in this magnetic line, and of course, guess what it's doing to all the iron in your body? It's flowing.
Same thing, right?
Start moving it. It's also going to move the magnetite, which is floating. There's millions of pieces of magnetite flowing in everybody's skulls. So it's obviously reorientating all that magnetite and getting you to have an altered state of imagination. So when you go to these places and you see things and you start dreaming, you should pay attention to those, because that's where the interaction point between the invisible universe and your body is taking place. And that's why it's called the imagination. It's the magi. You are in the realm of the magi. You become the magician. So, yes, these places were built deliberately at these hotspots for you to have that shamanic experience.
Do you think they might have been also set up as a mind control device to control people of that era?
I'm not so sure. I think that the original purpose of the sites was benevolent. It was always for the betterment of the population. But I think it's also down to who controls this. For example, if you look at the way that Washington, D.C. was set up by the Freemasons who built this country, they started this country with benevolent reasons. And, it really depends on who's in charge of all of this information, this energy, because as science has now found, human intent is a very powerful tool. It can be measured. You can use your intent, for example, to move the drum beat, a computerized drum beat in the middle of a laboratory, and they've done that in Princeton University. A group of 23 people can influence the way that a computerized drum beat will actually move. So your intent is very important. So if you have people in power, for example, let's take Washington as an example, if they are in charge of this sacred geometry and all this energy in one place, and their intent is for malevolent purposes, then they can control an entire population. As long as we're given permission to do so. So it always depends on who's in charge of all of these sites. But I think originally it was built for totally benevolent reasons, because the original rulers and the creator gods, as they used to be called, would realize that they're only as good as the people in the lowest rung of the ladder. So if they can bring up the level of the people, everybody benefits.
Let's go to Kevin in Fairbanks, Alaska, west of the Rockies. Kevin, go ahead, please.
Great. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
If you'd have the doctor address I thought he had a great statement. If you can stand it, it's great work. But the psychological effect of having this phenomena upon you can be quite draining.
How so? Explain that, Kevin, and then we'll get his comments.
It depends on how deeply you absorb the information. If you begin to live on a day-by-day basis, it's much more powerful than if you're just trying to do on the weekends.
All right. Has anybody talked about it as a draining experience, Freddie?
Very much so. In fact, it reminds me of the days when I was actually doing a lot of crop circle research. Again, for those who don't know, the genuine crop circles are built exactly on the same principles as a Stonehenge or a pyramid. They are electromagnetic, and they're sonic, and they're geometric. And I've gotten to the point where I actually can't go into crop circles anymore. I've absorbed so much of the electromagnetism into my body, as have a lot of people, a lot of the thousands who started off doing the crop circle research before I even got involved. A lot of them have now passed away, and because you're basically soaking this stuff up like blotting paper. So you should always watch your body. Your body is a great indicator of whether you should do things or not, and it's called the gut feeling. So if you feel like you're getting a little bit queasy, it's probably because you've sort of been dipping into the holy water a little bit too much, and you just back off a little bit, because your body is electromagnetic by nature, and too much of a good thing can be too much. So it's not in so much that they are detrimental. It's just that sometimes we as humans like to have too much of a good thing. So always watch out what your body's trying to say to you, and if it doesn't feel right, don't do it. And if it does, then keep doing it.
Does it make you a little more intuitive or anything like that?
Oh, very much so. Oh, absolutely. And if anybody had told me 20 years ago that I was going to be seeing energy lines, I would have told them that they were smoking something. And believe me, I mean, I've been a dowser for quite a while, but I don't even need the coat hangers to tell me where the lines are. I can actually watch these lines moving, and I can almost see them in color. So, yes, it does. The whole purpose of sacred sites is to improve your ability to get out of your left brain and get into the right brain, into the more intuitive side, because the ancients recognized that you're on a journey here of experience, and the lighter your body can be during this experience, the better you are at managing your self-control. So the more sort of psychic or more intuitive you become, the more aware you are become of the life around you. you can be precognizant of the events that are coming up. You know that you know how to prepare ahead of time for certain events which will not be beneficial to you. And so, in other words, you're having a degree of control over your life, and that's one of the reasons why they built these places. So you don't have to rely on other people to tell you what to do. You are in total control.
All right. Well, the name of the book, Legacy of the Gods by Freddy Silva. Freddy, thank you so much. You're one of the world's leaders in this kind of research. Well, my editor at Tor Forge is Bob Gleason. Also, David Hagberg has worked with Bob Gleason as well. And Bob calls David the Nostradamus of novelists. You'll find out why when we come back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the person you're going to be listening to tonight. David Hagberg is a best-selling worldwide author of thrillers, and he has a knack for creating fiction that becomes fact. David joined the Air Force right out of high school, where he was trained as a cryptographer stationed in Greenland above the Arctic Circle, and in Germany, where he helped construct the world's largest crypto center on the planet. He attended University of Maryland, the Overseas Division, and the University of Wisconsin, studying physics, mathematics, and philosophy. And here he is back on Coast to Coast. Hey, David, how are you?
I'm good. How are you this morning, George?
I'm doing fine. Nostradamus of novelists, eh?
Bob, our mutual editor, has a way with words.
I love it. How did a person who studied physics, mathematics, and philosophy end up being such a best-selling author? How'd that happen?
Oh, that's a heck of a question right off the chute, but I think the key word is not physics and math, it's philosophy. I was reading philosophy as a kid in junior high and high school, and a friend of mine later in life is a philosopher, and he said, you got to understand something about philosophy. It's a failed science or a failed thing. A philosopher comes out with an idea like Schopenhauer, like Kant, or something else, and they come up with a system. It sounds really good, but it's like science. Next year or 10 years later, somebody comes up with something else which totally negates them. And so I'm thinking philosophy is about probably a very, very fluid sort of a thing, a fluid science. It's soft. It's not all math and physics and stuff like that. And if the philosophers get it wrong, we're not going to all die. But what they do, which would intrigue me and still does, is that they sort of predict the future in a way. They play this what if game. What if this happened? What if that happened? And they build whole systems on it. And I guess that's my writing.
Well, you've got that ability. You see things that few see, and then they turn out to be true later on. Maybe you're more practical than they are. Maybe you have just more insight. But you're able to look at a puzzle before the pieces are put down.
Yeah, I'm not patting myself on the back or trying to be big on my britches, but some of this stuff seems to me so obvious. Back right after the end of the first Afghanistan war, when Bin Laden kicked the Russians out with his Taliban and all that out of Afghanistan, he issued what's called a fatwa, which is a religious order that it was the duty of all Muslims to kill every American man, woman, and child whenever or wherever, and if they died trying or doing it, they're going to go straight to paradise, to heaven. And I was reading about this guy, like in the New York Times or wherever, and I said, this is not some ordinary terrorist. He's well-educated. He's a multi-billionaire. His family is super connected. The Bin Ladens, those big earth-moving equipment that you see on highway projects, most of those were owned by Bin Laden Enterprises, his dad, and leased to various people here. Now, this guy... And I began to look at him, and there was a fellow by the name of Bodansky. I can't recall his first name, but he wrote a book called Osama bin Laden, the Man at War with America, and he was the advisor on bin Laden, these kinds of things, to Congress. Like, come on, these guys know what's going on, and they didn't do a damn thing about it. They just said, oh, yeah, okay, he's a bad guy, and he's very smart. So I thought, okay, this guy will hit us sooner or later. So I wrote a book called Joshua's Hammer that came out before 2001, in which Al-Qaeda does a major strike against the U.S. And I thought against some sort of an iconic place. And I used, instead of the World Trade Center, I used the Golden Gate Bridge. And in all my books, by the way, everything I've written never turns out bad because I have a hero, Kirk McGarvey, and he's sort of like Superman.
Saves the day, huh?
Yeah, he saves the day. I wish the hell we had guys like that.
Yeah.
But and everybody said, well, how could you predict Bin Laden was going to hit us? And I said, well, come on, guys, just open up your eyes. Read the newspaper and, read an article one day in the Times, then one on the Washington Post a day later, and then something else a month later, and it sort of sticks at the back of my craw, and I say like a philosopher, what if this happens? And some of it just seems so inevitable to me.
Well, and you've been spot on, which is kind of scary because you could be
Very
spot on
scary.
again. And your new
Very
book out
scary.
is The Abyss, and we're going to talk a lot about that tonight in some various segments here on the program, David. I want to get your reaction because you do have incredible insight. Shimon Peres, the Israeli president, is saying that it's imminent that they're going to attack Iran. I mean, I've never heard this before of a national leader of a country coming out before anything happens and simply say it's going to happen. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, some of that's psychological.
Right.
The Israelis are very good at this, and by the way, they're not alone. We're sort of behind them in the Stuxnet virus.
And by the way, that was Bodansky, wasn't it, who wrote that book?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
A very bright guy. In fact, it's sitting on my bookshelf here someplace.
Okay.
I read that, I don't know how many times, underlined it. But the Israelis do little opening shots. For instance, it was a few months ago, that they did some air training with their jet bombers in an area off the Med, off their coast. And these were practice bomb runs, simulated bomb runs that had nothing to do with shipping, had nothing to do with any incursion in the border. It had to do, and the whole purpose of these training exercises was to pinpoint hit a target and with deep penetration bombs. And it was obvious to anybody who saw that they were training for a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Mm-hmm. And they've been asking for, it must be 3 years or 4 years or more for now, from us, from the U.S., bunker-busting bombs. And we have said, no, you can't have them. You don't need them. And about, maybe it's less than a year ago, there was just a small squib somewhere, maybe it was online, or I think it was the New York Times, or maybe Jane's Defense, that said the U.S. was considering honoring the request for bunker busting, and then nothing. So that's kind of government speak to me that, yeah, they've got bunker.
They've got them. Yeah.
So number one, Netanyahu orders this military exercise, but wide open. And they're not trying to hide it. So there's message one to Iran. Message two to Iran, the Stuxnet virus, it's hard to pronounce, but that's put in Iran's nuclear program in their centrifuges, which separates the uranium into highly reactive uranium.
It really screwed up their programming, didn't it?
Put them back about a year or two, and that's the crucial part of one of the crucial parts of building a nuclear weapon. So that was number two. And number three, so it's sort of a psychological war. Number three says, we're coming to get you, baby. Hang on. And of course, number four, the U.S., we have really tightened the screws on Iran financially and cut off their bank accounts, their banking for all practical purposes outside of Iran. And it's really screwing them up. It's really hamstringing them. So it's sort of like, these are their opening salvos. These are opening shots, and it seems to be working. Ahmadinejad was on TV, I don't know, a week ago, crying and bemoaning and saying that they can hardly do business because the bad guys. And they're also, you can watch all this stuff together, and it's kind of, like you say, it's a jigsaw puzzle. They in Iranian newspapers, they're having a field day with all this protest that we're having against big banks in the country.
They think it's almost like the Arab Spring here, don't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so all this fits together as this sort of a complicated, fluid puzzle, which I find endlessly fascinating.
Talked to a couple guys that I know who are Americans. They moved from Iran years ago, and they still have family back there, and they are convinced, David, that there will be no war with Iran. They're convinced. And I don't know if it's wishful thinking or what, but they say it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I think otherwise.
Wishful thinking, it really is. The fact of the matter is, and this is part, I'm doing a series of ecological thrillers, and I'm calling them sort of the energy wars group, because we're going to be at war here shortly, starting out with Iran and Venezuela. It may not be an all-out shooting war, because there's some interesting thing that Iran and Venezuela are doing. But any country that is, number one, hostile to us and doesn't even acknowledge the existence, say, of Israel, and they're building nuclear weapons, and they do have rockets to deliver these nuclear weapons. We're going to sit up and take notice.
That's right.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody sort of had their head in the sand with Hitler. But if Hitler had developed a nuclear weapon, let's say in 1940 or 42, it would have been a whole different ballgame. Our response would have been much, much sooner, much quicker. So, yeah, I think we're going to war with Iran, but will it be boots on the ground? No, I think we're going to have a different war. These drone things that we're doing, just in a year or so, we've killed 1,500 high Al-Qaeda, important people in Al-Qaeda with drones that some guy sitting back in the States somewhere can control with a joystick, and that may be the future. And there's all sorts of other neat things. Even in boots on the ground, they're trying this, and I can babble on all night, but there's
well, you're on with me all night, so go ahead.
So now we're trying a weapon, which I think this is incredibly cool. I have a friend who was a contractor, and he clues me into all this stuff. There's a weapon that we have. It's a rifle. I think it's 10 millimeter that has a heat seeker built into the head of each bullet.
Like a little missile.
Yeah, like a little missile. And so some guy is hiding behind a wall out there 50 or 100 yards, and he pops out every now and then and fires a bunch of shots. You just fire in the general direction of the wall, and the bullet will go around the corner and hit the guy. I mean, so this is, when you say, and I agree with you, George, that there's going to be a war with Iran, it ain't going to be like what we're doing in Afghanistan or Iraq, because Iran is a lot more sophisticated than those guys.
That's
lot
right.
more.
Far more sophisticated than Saddam Hussein was during Desert Storm in 91, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to get into this big government debate whether we believe that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction.
Moot point.
But everybody, even Gaddafi had a nuclear program and a microbial program, and he gave it up. He said I did publicly, and he gave it up at some point. And he realized just because you have a powerful weapon doesn't mean you're going to be the big kid on the block. Doesn't mean you're going to win. I mean, so there's a lot more complicated stuff going on. I'll write a novel about this one of these days. But let's say, just for the heck of it, that Israeli bombs don't take out their nuclear ambitions, and they do build a nuclear weapon, and they've got, and we can talk about North Korea in a minute, who does have them, and they've got the missile. Now, what does Iran do with this nuclear weapon? Do they attach it to a missile, and they fire it on Tel Aviv and wipe out Tel Aviv? Do you realize, and they realize, what would happen to Iran? They'd be wiped off. They'd be
gone.
The face of the earth.
They'd be gone.
And so, just to have these fabulously expensive toys isn't the end all to be all. What they are, and this is what we're most afraid of. We're not afraid so much of being attacked. What we're afraid of is the political advantage that having nuclear weapons gives to a country. North Korea. Their people are eating grass soup, for the God's sake.
Yeah.
They're starving to death, and yet they've developed nuclear weapons. They got 5 or 6 of them, something as many as 10 nuclear weapons. Very crude, but it doesn't matter.
And they got missile capability.
They got 3-stage missiles, which is capable of hitting western United States, California, not that area. Something as deep as Colorado, probably not. They wouldn't be so, although he's crazy, they wouldn't be so stupid as to use them, but, and this is the point, it gives them this political advantage that we're pussyfooting around. We're not saying get rid of this or do this or else. We're saying, why don't we sit down and talk? And Kim Jong-il says, okay, we'll sit down and talk. And a few months later he says, oh, the heck with you guys. We're not going to sit down and talk. And so we sit back for a while and fume and give interviews on newspaper and television. And a few months later, said, "Well, sir, why don't we sit down and talk?" And he'll say, "Sure, we'll sit down and talk." And nothing ever happens because the guy's got nuclear weapons, which gives him not really military power, because he'd be really stupid to use them, but it gives him political leverage. And so it's a lot more subtle than just having a big club.
I'm going to do a David Hagberg prediction here. You tell me how close I am.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to even predict in the order of the falling of these countries, with some kind of armed conflict or some kind of conflict, maybe something from within. Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and then the last one will be North Korea.
You're not too far off, and there's some more mixed things. I did a piece. I can't remember who I wrote this for, but it's called Flashpoints. That there are some flashpoints. Venezuela is one of them. Iran is one of them. North Korea is one of them. Places where if something was back against the wall, and Kim Jong-il is really nuts, and he drinks cognac, by the way. He's got probably one of the most expensive collections of fine cognacs in the entire world, and he watches American Western movies.
He loves those cognac bottles, doesn't he?
Cognac bottles, and he loves watching American Western movies. Go figure that. At any rate, if his back's against the wall, he might lob a missile or two into India, which would be a mess. Venezuela with Chavez and all that is certainly a flashpoint. Another flashpoint I'm thinking is an armed Taiwan. Sooner or later, China's just going to get sick of this, and I'm envisioning a time where somebody puts a finger on a trigger mistakenly and blows one of our cruisers out of the Taiwan Strait. And if they do, there's a big mess there. They can just go after Taipei. But you were pretty right on.
Yeah. I think in that case, China might say, look, you folks are into Iran, Syria, Venezuela. You're trying to get into North Korea. You're in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's our turn.
Yeah. Yep.
And as much as we've got this agreement with Taiwan, I do think we're going to be spread way too thin, and the Chinese are going to pop into Taiwan in some form or fashion.
Right. We don't have enough boots on the ground. We don't have enough boots to put on the ground anymore. Even pulling them all out of Iraq, which may be a mistake. But China, now that's a whole. We could spend 6 days talking about that mess, because China, not poor China, but China is damned if they do and damned if they don't. Their political aims are quite different than ours all around the world, especially in that region, North Korea, who they're ashamed of.
And we're their best client.
That's right. We're their biggest trading power. Now, partner, not only that, they hold, $1 trillion worth of our debt, our government bonds. So, if they go to war with us, they're just wiping out this whole huge amount of money that is coming their way, is that owed to them. If the guy down the street owes me, $100,000, I don't know if I'm going to really badmouth him so bad. As a matter of fact, I might even try to help him with his new job or new invention, so he's going to make enough money to pay me back.
Exactly. You want to help him.
It's a really complicated, there's an old Chinese proverb said, it's a curse. May you live in interesting times. And it's a curse. Well, we sure the hell live in interesting times. Bad for people, very good for writers.
Yeah, that is so true, David. So true indeed. Let's talk a little bit about this vision you see of a major war, which we've been hinting about here. But you also see it over energy, don't you?
Excuse me. Yeah, it's a war not so much like World War II or even like Iran or Iraq. It's going to be a lot more subtle than that, much more technical. And the energy war is only the start. It's going to be a water war coming our way, too. And I think all this is going to come to fruition well within 10 years. The fact of the matter is, whether you believe it or don't believe it, and a lot of conservatives don't, that we're warming up the planet. The planet is warming up naturally, but we as our human intervention is warming up the planet. We're pumping CO2. China and India is coming online by burning coal.
We're helping a natural cycle along.
We're helping a natural cycle, and it couldn't come at a worse time, because we're in 100,000-year cycles of carbon dioxide, which we're coming into that cycle again. And we're also, the sun, I've just been reading about this, the sun does not produce just a steady amount of energy. It fluctuates.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons. Hey, David, hold on. We're going to hit this break pretty soon, and I want to come back and we'll talk more about your thoughts about this next war and just what's happening all over the place. David's latest book is called Abyss, and his website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And we're talking to the Nostradamus of novelists, David Hagberg. His latest work, by the way, is called Abyss. And we'll be back with David in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And we've returned. David Hagberg with us on Coast to Coast AM. David, so let's review this possibility of a major war over energy. Go ahead.
The fact of the matter is, energy, obviously, energy is running everything. Electricity, let's say, and in this country, 47% of all the electricity that's produced is produced by burning coal, which is really dirty. And there's only maybe 100 years, if that, of oil in the ground, and using oil and petroleum products to run cars, planes, boats, and trains is really stupid in the long run, because we're going to run out of oil. We're obviously going to run out of oil. It gets. I want to get it complicated real quick here shortly. Nuclear energy is problematic because even a small nuclear power plant puts out about 9,000 metric tons of highly radioactive waste every year, and there's no place to store it. So in most cases, this stuff is stored in concrete-lined barrels right on site. So if you got a nuclear plant anywhere near you, you know there's just tons and tons of nuclear waste that's going to be deadly for 100,000 plus years. Now it's going to get a little more complicated, because hydroelectric seems to be a nice, clean way to do things, but with global warming and whatever causes global warming, I have my ideas, is causing snowpack rather, and glaciers to shrink. And melting glaciers, melting snowpack runs down the rivers, goes through dams, and produces electricity. So we've got a little spurt for now, but it's going to be over here shortly. Windmills are fine, but they're noisy as hell, and the wind doesn't blow all the time.
And you need 100,000 of them all over the place, don't you?
Yes, and solar cells, solar energy is still in its infancy, and the problem with solar cells, and they're finding it on these Mars rovers, is that the solar mirrors, the part that receives the sun, get dusty.
They get dusty. You got to clean them.
And you got to clean them. Well, clean, 500 acres of these things, and you got a big job, and they're tender. They get. So, where does all this energy come from? There's two possible ways. There's one on these massive programs of mining energy from the sea, which is what my book Abyss is about. You could put tens of thousands of windmills, and I've designed a new windmill that instead of rotating blades, they have gigantic bird wings, which just flap, they turn into the breeze, and they flap like birds. They don't make any noise. You can make them pink and purple, and it'll look pretty. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what clued me into this whole thing. This is this little thing that sort of stuck way in the back of my mind. And I can't remember the guy's first name, but he's Saudi Arabia's, or was Saudi Arabia's Minister of Oil. His last name is El Naimi, and he went to the original George Bush, and the first George Bush, who was pushing alternative energy, and this was in the Washington Post, excuse me, and he said, take care, Mr. President, with any kind of an alternative energy thing, because our lives, our livelihood is dependent upon
oil.
You buying oil. We have nothing else. There's no tourism or anything like that.
Right, no industry, nothing.
Yep. No, if you really push this alternative energy, we're going to have to do other things. And we know that China and we know that emerging India will buy our fuel. So be very, very careful what you do. And that, honest to God, slowed down our alternative energy research. So what's going to happen, and all these OPEC countries are saying the same thing to us. We're caught between a rock and a hard place, and any person was like, if somebody comes into my home and backs me in a corner, I'm going to fight back. Well, we are rapidly getting backed into a corner as a country. So we're trying all electric vehicles, but all electric vehicles take electricity, which means we got to produce the electricity somehow.
And we've got an antiquated grid, don't we?
Yeah. We can spend all night talking about that too. So sooner or later, countries like Venezuela, who hate us anyway, and countries like Iran, who hate us, and Saudi Arabia, who tells us to be cautious.
Who hate us, but they don't tell us that directly.
Yeah, they hate us and they love us because they need the money.
Yeah, exactly.
And sooner or later, we're going to get into some sort of a furball, some sort of a dust-up. We have a program on the books, excuse me, that we deny, but we do have the program on the books called Operation Balboa, which Venezuela only has 7 really decent forward air bases from which they can launch American-made fighter jets, by the way, into the air. And our Operation Balboa, which the Venezuelans have always thought we were going to use to take down the government, it's just going to wipe out those 7 forward air bases, which would deny Chavez that striking power, that air power. Well, if we did that, he's going to strike back. The only way he really knows how is by cutting off the oil spigots. That's not that important. I think he's either the 4th or 5th. He's number 4 or 5 in oil suppliers. Sure. Canada's first, Mexico's 2, Saudi Arabia.
But he's got thousands of Citgo gas stations here, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. So he can pull the plug on those, and so these are the kinds of things. These are the kinds of opening shots of a war. But people keep knocking at our borders. We're going to have to do something more than Operation Balboa. And it all ties in what we were talking about in the first segment with Iran and the Stuxnet virus, and now bunker-busting bombs for Israelis. And so we hit Iran. Sooner or later, that's going to have to happen, and we agree on that.
Yeah, with Chavez, I think are we going to wait until he dies of cancer?
There's a couple of guys waiting in the wings who are as bad as there's a couple of guys who are more pro-democracy, and Chavez and his people keep knocking them down, arresting them. There was one assassination a few months ago, so that's going to get to be more complicated.
Okay.
But so energy. We're going to fight over energy. We're going to fight over water later. We're going to fight over energy. And here is where we're extraordinarily vulnerable.
Now, is this a prediction or is this the novelist speaking?
This is, well, I guess it's a little bit of both. But this is, again, an article somewhere in the Wall Street Journal was sometime in 2009 sort of stuck in the back of my head, which is part of what's the genesis of this energy wars thing I'm talking about. The FBI's cyber crimes unit and the CIA has a similar unit. At some point found out that, and we're going to talk about the grid, our power grid in a minute, that the way electrical power is shunted around the country is runs through 600 different control centers, and all by computers. And these computers, we find out, have been infected with a very, very sophisticated virus. This is true stuff. A virus that's so sophisticated, it has to have come either from Russia or China. They're the only countries with that capability.
The virus is in the system now?
Right now, right in the system right now, since before 2009. That means with a push of a button, they could shut down all electricity in the United States. That's an interesting thought. But China, of course, and Russia deny it. And our cyber crimes unit and some of our best minds say, well, we'll remove the virus. Well, they can't.
But they know it's in there.
They know it's in there. They know all about it. And if they attempted to remove the virus, it's like a house of cards, taking the bottom card out, the whole mess would become tumbling down. And the best analysts say, well, China or Russia aren't going to use this. They're not going to push the button unless it came to some sort of a war. Right, unless our backs were against the wall, their backs were against the wall, and they pushed the button, and all the electricity across the United States will fail. So in a book that I'm working on right now with Senator Byron Dorgan from North Dakota, I've got anything's for sale. You and I know that. Anything is for sale. So an angry Iran their seamen, seamen, no, it's Venezuela, SAVAK, their Secret Service gets a hold of a disgruntled Russian engineer, and they buy
this
a copy of a virus.
Yeah.
And they share it with Venezuela. And the point is they're going to drop all our electricity as a retaliatory measure. And it will be far, far easier than you can imagine because our electrical grid is possibly the worst on the entire planet. It is a total mess.
Well, let me tell you one of the problems, too, David, and you've seen this, and I've witnessed this just in St. Louis when lightning hits a transformer. There aren't a lot of those things available.
No, and we're talking about not those little cans that sit up on the top of the pole.
We're talking about the big ones.
The big ones, and we don't make them in this country. They're made overseas. In China, I guess some, but Germany makes these things. And there's a 3-year waiting list for them. So if a transformer is knocked out, and we don't have many spares, and there's only just a few hundred of them that do all this work across the country. If you knocked out a half a dozen of those alone with a little sabotage, and these things, they're prone to lightning. But these big things, they're like about the size of a 2-car garage. These things are not guarded. They're behind, barbed wire fences.
Barbed wire fences, that's right.
Fence. But you'd be pretty stupid to climb over a fence into a facility that's got a couple 100,000 volts running to it.
Unless you're on a suicide mission.
Unless you're on a suicide mission, you lob a bomb over and you wipe it out. It would be really screwed up. So when I was talking earlier about this energy wars, this is how it will start. But let's get back a minute to this grid because I've been learning about this, and this is just, the more I read, my mouth drops open. I say, come on, I could not have invented this.
Well, and explain this to us, David, the grid, so people can understand how this works.
Well, I'll try to make it simple. What happens is the people who produce the power stations and all that, they don't own the high voltage transmission line, those great big honking things that you see going across country when you're driving. Those are the transmission line, and they hook this thing up. It's called a grid. And that means in theory, all plants that generate electricity all over the United States produce, and wind turbines and any nukes, anything that produces electricity, gets plugged in to a high voltage line somewhere which runs across the country. Now, ideally, let's say wind turbines in California, if they're producing a little extra energy, all that electricity could go on these high wire lines, and a computer would direct that. Let's say this power was needed in New York City because it's hot, and so the power would go there. But that's not the way that's the way it works everywhere else, not in our country.
We can't do that, can we?
We cannot do that. We have three interconnects, they're called. All the power that's generated by power stations in the eastern United States, from about the Dakotas east, so I'm roughly the Mississippi east, is all connected together from Maine to Florida. So if somebody in Florida has a little extra power, they can ship it up to Minneapolis, or in Des Moines, if they get a little extra power, they can ship it to South Carolina and New York. All that works just fine. Excuse me.
Okay.
But there is also the Western Interconnect. That's a group of high transmission lines west from the northern United States. Canada's in the mix there, all the way to Southern California. So if Los Angeles needs a little extra power, they can get it from Nevada, but Los Angeles cannot get it from Minneapolis, right? So they're not connected, these two. So everything on the West Coast has to deal with the West Coast. Everything on the East Coast has to deal with the East Coast. And then Texas, all by itself, has their own, the Texas Interconnect. And Texas cannot transmit power, excess power, up to New York or up to places like that. Now, to complicate matters, there is no one federal authority that has any teeth to run all these, coordinate all this big mess. And the whole big mess is run by 600 different control centers that don't all talk to each other. And the thing with electricity is you can't store it effectively. You can't have like big batteries to store the power from, let's say, a nuclear power plant. Whenever power is needed, that's when it has to be produced. And if you produce power that's not needed, then it doesn't go into the grid. They shut down the turbine.
We don't have the capacitor to do that, do we?
We don't have the capacity for that. So a lot of times these wind farms in California, they have to shut the things down. The electricity has nowhere to go on the grid, even though they desperately need it, let's say in Des Moines. Now, I couldn't make that stuff up, and it's even more complicated than that because...
And how old is this system, David?
Yeah, well, a lot of this has started out in the 1800s.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah,
really?
late 1800s. And we stopped using steel. We stopped using copper long ago. We use aluminum, or spinal aluminum.
That's right.
And aluminum does oxidize. It rusts in the air, and it sags. So you see those big curves, from the power line from one power pole or pylon to the next, they sag. And as they get older, they sag more and more, and sooner or later they sag enough to touch metal or touch ground, and you got that mess. It's almost as bad as their air traffic control system. Some of the computers are so antiquated that guys write orders on slips of paper and pass it from council to council. And the fact is, if all of a sudden it's a warmer than predicted night in Manhattan and they need a bunch of electricity, we may not have the electricity to send to them, which is why the brownouts. And they call them rolling brownouts. The computer will say in one control center, well, they need a lot of extra electricity in New York. We don't have enough to give them. So what we're going to do is reduce electricity in New Jersey for a little while, and then an hour later we're going to reduce electricity here, an hour later reduce electricity here. And if there is one relay that doesn't click, one computer that goes down, then you have a blackout, massive blackout.
And we've seen that happen.
And that's just the start. Now, okay, with all that said, if I wanted to start a war with the United States, that's the first place I'd hit, where we're vulnerable, our underbelly.
Yes.
That's
what we do, right?
Absolutely. That's the natural way. That's the way to do things. And what astounds me is that we're not rebuilding the computers piece by piece. Now, we're going to get into money in a minute. We're not rebuilding computers piece by piece. We're not building factories to build these transformers that are so desperately needed. They're the ones, a power plant, produces, let's say, a voltage of only 10,000 volts, and with a high amperage. So they have this big transformer that steps that voltage up from 10,000 volts up to 750,000 volts. And that's the stuff that goes on the big high power lines across country. At the other end, wherever they end up, where they're going to be distributed, another big transformer takes that 750,000 volts and brings it back down to 10,000 volts. And those are the big transformers that are vulnerable. You take out those, you have no way of sending energy from across this grid, this fractured grid.
And you say there are no backups.
There are no backups, and it's astounding.
You can't wheel in a new transformer.
And it astounds me, George, we're not buying them. We're not ordering them and putting them in a warehouse someplace against
Oh, my God, yeah. That should be just like the nation's oil reserves.
Thank you. So we're going to war. We know it's going to be a ground war, and we're going to need tanks, so let's buy some tanks and some rifles and some bullets. So we're not doing it. We're not doing it. And I don't, again, I've talked to Bob.
That is amazing.
About this, and he said, I can't believe this, Dave. And I said, I can't believe it either. I mean, it's national. It's I don't know, national crying shame if you want. We're leaving ourselves vulnerable and saying, okay, I'm leading my chin out here, my guard is down, punch me if you will, and it's going to happen.
Why isn't anybody smart enough to do this?
Okay, let's get back to the money thing. It's hubris and it's greed. I thought to myself, we live in Florida. We moved into a house, it's about 6 years ago. And it was for sale or for lease. And I can't remember the cost, like $3.99, let's say it was. And I'm just some novelist sitting here in Florida, and I said, no, I think what we're going to do is lease this house. We'll rent it for a while.
Don't have to come up with a down payment, and you go. Right?
We were going toward a real estate bubble. I could see that. That was obvious as the day is long.
Yeah.
So this $399,000 house has gone down to $179,000.
Wow.
So had I bought that, even put $100,000 down at $299, I'd still be underwater. Now, of course, the people don't want to sell the house. I don't blame them, but Look, I'm not a financial guru. I'm just a novelist, and Bob calls me Nostradamus, but it's more national things, that international things.
Well, hold on, Nostradamus. We're going to hit this break, David. We're going to come right back with you in just a moment as we talk more about things you see in the future. And our special guest tonight, David Hagberg, as we talk about his visions of the future, his work, Abyss. Back with David and more on Coast to Coast AM. David, as we discuss, what's the premise of Abyss?
Abyss. Pretty much what we're talking about, except I got to add one more thing.
All right.
I mean, this is such a complicated subject. Like the whole business of the grid was complicated, the business of increasing carbon dioxide and all that. So I got to add one more complication, and then everything else will become clear because I'm talking about a Pearl Harbor, upcoming Pearl Harbor here, sort of thing. What's happening is somebody invented these, what do they call, financial exotics. Among them are derivatives, hedge funds, credit default swaps, things like that.
Like the mortgages, right?
You like the mortgage, yeah, when they bundle mortgages. But a derivative is nothing more, and this all ties into what I'm going to talk about, if you bear with me for a minute.
All right.
A derivative is nothing more than a sort of an insurance policy. It's as if I were to insure my next-door neighbor's house for $250,000, even though I didn't own the house, the neighbor didn't owe me any money, I had no interest in that house. I had no underlying interest. I still could insure that house for $250,000. So if it burned down, I'd get the $250,000. I wouldn't have to rebuild the house.
Not your neighbor, you would.
I would.
All right.
Now, 6 other investors could also insure the same house for $250,000. Even though they weren't dealing with me, they weren't dealing with the neighbor. So if the house did burn down, it would give me a pretty powerful incentive to burn it down myself. But if it did burn down, 7 of us would each collect $250,000 on this one house.
On the one that was never going to be rebuilt.
That's right. And the insurance company would lose all this money. They've got to pay out $1 million or so on a $250,000 house. And they would in turn send the loss on to their other policyholders by increasing premiums. The same thing is happening right now. I don't know, these guys, I think you're either stupid or think we're stupid. And it was the same with the real estate. There are oil fund derivatives. And they're right now, honest to God, the oil derivative positions in this country amount to more than 7 times the total amount of oil reserves in the ground and the predicted future reserves that we might find.
What are they trying to buy?
Money. They're just making money on money. They're buying nothing. They're just making money on money. And so they're shifting. So if I shift a few $1 billion over another derivative position, somebody's going to have to buy that, pay for that derivative, and I'm going to get the money. I'm a hedge fund or a derivative fund manager. And the fact of the matter is, it's like a Ponzi scheme. Sooner or later, we'll run out of oil, these derivative positions will come due, and somebody's going to have to pony up 7 times.
They don't have the money.
Oh, no, they would bankrupt the entire planet. So that's the game we're playing at. Now, George, if you had a couple of $1 trillion at stake, more than chump change, and somebody took a run at your position and tried to stop you or try to sidestep you to make your position worthless, you would fight back.
You have to fight back.
You'd have to fight back. And a lot of these guys, like they're 35 or 40 years old, they say, well, I'm not going to fail and go to prison and for the rest of my life, or if I'm 60, I'm not going to end up like Madoff for the rest of my life in prison. So I'm going to do whatever it takes to hold my position. So here comes, now we got the derivative thing. Here comes what I think would be a Pearl Harbor. If we push just the one thing, just all electric cars, if we can perfect the batteries and we can actually go to plug in at our house overnight and get, let's say, 200 or 300 mile range.
Something reasonable.
Yeah, something reasonable. Not 60 or 70 with a gasoline engine, but purely electric power. What that would do would devastate some of these oil derivative people. So the idea is we don't want to produce cheap, clean electricity. They don't want us to produce cheap, clean electricity so that we're just talking one segment, so that our cars will run on electricity. It is very important to these derivative fungi. So it's not the countries.
They need the price of oil to stay high.
They need the price of oil to be high. It'd be great to have $25, $30, $40 a gallon for gasoline, but that would be cutting their own throats. They need it around $4, $3 or $4, and people don't worry so much about alternative energy. We'll pony up $3 or $4. We'll get slightly more efficient gasoline.
You go higher than that, we got a problem.
And we got a problem. So the whole idea, so it's complicated. The whole idea is to keep us using gasoline or diesel to run our cars and our trucks and everything like that. And if we go all electricity, it's going to hurt their position badly. So how do we go all electricity? By producing cleaner electricity, by more nuclear power plants, by new innovations in coal. And they're doing a book about clean coal, how to convert coal into methane by using microbes. At any rate, so if this at Al-Naimi, the Saudi Arabian oil minister, warned Bush, the original George Bush, watch out this alternative energy for exactly that reason. So here comes Al-Qaeda right now, is linked with all this, the new Al-Qaeda after bin Laden is gone. They are right now in Pakistan. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they had the help of the Pakistani ISI, the intelligence.
Right, either way.
They're teaching these young suicide bombers how to attack nuclear power plants. How to destroy or how to disable.
Well, and that was a concern after 9/11 that they were going to fly into the towers of nuke plants. Remember that?
Yeah, that's not going to work though. The concrete containment domes on a nuclear plant are
pretty
much
strong.
stronger than. Pretty strong. The airplane would crash, do some damage, but not release any nuclear material. No, you go into a control room. You get into a control room, which is pretty easy to do. There's no real like armed guards or things with machine guns guarding these things. You get into a control room, kill the people in the control room pretty easily, and disable what's called a scram panel, which is what if something goes bad. The reactors would shut down. If you destroy the scram panel and the reactors can't shut down, they'll go into or be moderated. They'll go into a runaway mode and they'll melt down just like Fukushima over in Japan.
We should have troops stationed around every nuke plant.
Not only just the control center for each nuclear power plant. Have that hardened. In Abyss, in this book I wrote, I've got a terrorist doing just that. He gets inside, and this guy's very sophisticated. Was South African self-defense force, and he's very sophisticated. And they've got an Al-Qaeda kid who they took as a kid, and they trained him in all these nuclear power plants.
Are they all suicide potential people?
Yeah, they pretty much are, and then the reason being was explained to me by somebody who knows more about this than I do. That how do I put this easily? There's a greater belief, a more firm belief,
conviction,
hereafter, if you will, as in this country. Here we go to church and we do all that, but we don't have that fervent belief that a lot of Muslims do. And when they die, especially if they die a martyr, they are going to paradise right now. No purgatory, and they're going to have what is 99
72
virgins,
72
virgins. It sounds pretty good to me, actually, and so they're willing to do this because they're,
I think one or two's enough, don't you?
Yeah, one or two. Well, I don't know. When you're up in paradise, maybe you have these superpowers. Who knows? And I'm not making light of this because consider a lot of these people come from slums where the only clean water is dirty water. They're not enough to eat. They're not educated.
They don't have jobs. They don't have money. They don't have anything.
There's no future.
There's
no future. And Al-Qaeda, one of the reasons they were so successful, especially at the beginning, is they'd take a kid or a young man from some slum or ghetto and say, strap on this suicide vest, go kill yourself, and we're going to give your parents, your family, $50,000 cash money, American $100 bills.
Which they probably didn't do.
Oh, no, they did do it.
Did they do that?
Yeah, because otherwise the word would get around, well, I'm dead and my parents aren't going to get anything.
Yeah,
So, they did pass out the money.
Stiffed, literally.
Yeah. So what happens is the opening shots of this, and I call it a Pearl Harbor, the opening shots of this energy war, and the only reason for the energy war ultimately is to protect trillions of dollars worth of derivatives, so it's all the fat cats doing this stuff. It will be a strike on one or two nuclear power plants to make nuclear power unpalatable. Like in Germany, since this Japanese thing in Germany, they're going to, within 20 years, they're going to close down all their nuclear power plants.
Yeah, they want out.
They want out. And if you dumped a couple of our nuclear power plants and spread some radiation around, worse than 3 Mile Island, worse than Chernobyl, you would find a public backlash against nuclear energy. Right now there's 104 plants online in the United States, and we've got 30 in a permitting process right now. Those permits would dry up. Of the 104, I think fully a third of them are due for re-permitting, to allow them. That would go down by the wayside.
Well, what percent, by the way, David, these 104, what percent of the energy do they give us?
Not huge. I think it's in the range of 18 or 20%, because coal produces 47% of our energy. That's the big. That's
the big
thing.
One right now.
But it's a significant. Take 5% away. That's a significant amount of electrical power that's not going to be sent to this incredibly shaky grid to begin with. And so the whole idea of electric cars would become less and less palatable because electricity prices would absolutely skyrocket. Right, so we'd have to keep using gasoline and oil. That's just a start. Now we can. The whole idea is to stop using just this one segment. Stop using electrical vehicles. So let's hit. We talked about those transformers. Let's hit 3 or 4 or 5 key transformers. Have you ever seen armed guards or even a chain link fence around these big high power lines that go across the country?
Nope.
So they're vulnerable. Take a high-power rifle, sit back a few, 100 feet or a few hundred feet, so you're not going to get electrocuted.
Snap them.
And snap the insulators. The lines will come down.
By the way, you're not saying anything that some terrorist hasn't already thought of, right? I don't want people to say, Nostradamus here is giving people ideas.
Yeah, right. I hope the hell not. Although I was on some radio show at some point a number of years ago and talking about all these things.
Probably ours.
It might have been, but somebody called. It was a call-in show. Somebody called in and said, "Well, it's very good, Mr. Hagberg, that you're predicting this, you're predicting that, and why don't you ever think about writing a love story?" So all on one day, coordinated. We're going to take out we're going to take out a couple of nuclear reactors to make nuclear power unpalatable. We're going to hit a few insulators, take down a few power lines. Not a lot, but some coming into New York, some coming to L.A. to give us some blackouts and the like to make electricity in the public's mind. All we have to do is get the public's perception.
With the idea that they're going to die, right? The individuals.
That they're going to die, that electricity is too precious to use for automobiles when we have gasoline at $3 or $4 a gallon. I mean, it's gasoline's been good for my father, my grandfather. It's good enough for me. And sooner or later, we'll get electricity, and Christ, oil's not going to run out for 100 years. And if you listen to the oil companies, they say that's at present technologies. We're finding more and more oil. We're going to dig oil, drill for oil in the Arctic. We're not even talking about methane hydrates, which would kill us all real quick. We're going to do all these things. So, yeah, we're going to run out of oil, and there's going to be a problem, but it ain't going to be a problem for at least 100 years. And that's what this energy war, as I talked about, is going to be a different kind of war than anything we've ever seen before. It's going to be a war like Hitler. He wanted prestige, but he also wanted to bring all the German peoples together, what he perceived as, and he wanted to have a European Reich, the Third Reich. So that would be all. And,
well, he almost pulled it off, David.
He damn near did. If he had made a couple of mistakes, if he had listened to his generals, they would have hit England before we got there. And if he would have left Russia alone, he would have had all of Europe, and we would have been hard pressed to dig him out. So the same thing here. If we take out some transformers, take out some lines, hit a couple of nukes, pretty soon the public is going to say, yeah, fine, the gasoline that we've got is fine. And they have won the war. And
so are you saying not only in the novel The Abyss, but your prediction that these wars will be started by people who are looking for economic gain?
Yep. Well, they're not going to start. The derivative guys, and I'm going to get calls and nasty. They're going to call me rotten names. They're not going to physically push any buttons, but they're going to. This is all so tied up politically and so tied up with influence, spheres of influence and the like. So these guys and gals too, who have trillions of dollars on the table, are going to make a suggestion here, make a nudge here. They're not going to actually hire a suicide bomber to take out a nuke. They're not going to actually hire a hunter or somebody or a gunman to shoot out, but they're going to make it real palatable for these people to do these kinds of things.
See, I'm convinced, David, that even with 9/11, somebody hired bin Laden. Somebody higher up said, we like what you folks are doing. This is what we'd like done. We've got our own agenda.
You want to hear something scarier than that, George?
What?
What runs all this, of course, is money.
That's right.
And there are probably 100 or more different charities in the United States that still do, some of them in Orlando and Detroit and places like that, that funnel money into Al-Qaeda. And there must, well, let's see, Amnesty International said there are 10,000 different terrorist organizations alive and kicking in the world today, 10,000 of them. A lot of them are just minor and small, but this money it has been and still is funneled to people like Al-Qaeda and all these 10,000 terrorist groups. And so, yes, money is incentive. So you got a guy like Obama. Excuse me,
bin Laden.
Bin Laden, yeah, and you get a guy like that who has grand dreams, who wants to do things, but doesn't have the money to do it. Just feed him money and let him go. Let us imagine. The same thing happens with my publisher and me. They say, okay, let's feed Hagberg some money, and his brain will come up with some real strange things. He'll write books. We'll all make money. And they leave the ideas to me. They just throw money at me and say, as long as the guy can eat and buy a 6-pack of beer every now and then,
he's happy.
He'll be happy and he'll produce for us. So that's the same thing. So yes, you're right, but maybe not some specific nefarious guy meeting him in a dark alley and say, "This is what I want you to do." And by the way, we're going so far afield, but all this stuff is so interesting. I was reading somewhere, and it was like a letter to the editor that they're saying, well, it was just happenstance that the trade towers fell down. They didn't know. And I said, baloney. Bin Laden had at his fingertips some engineers who knew how the trade center, the buildings were built. With that kind of a steel structure, and they knew very well if they could hit the top floors of these buildings with airlines that had just taken off there filled with fuel, it would melt the top stories, melt the structure, and the whole thing would come tumbling down. They tried the same thing in the 90s with a bomb in the basement. They figured if they could take out the underpinnings, that the whole building, in that case, they wanted the buildings to tip over.
And somebody may have had a bomb down in the bottom, too, because there were reports of explosions down there.
Yep, that's very, very possible. But these guys knew exactly what they're doing. And just as our guys, too, my prediction, see, in my books, this is not going to happen because Kirk McGarvey is ultimately going to save the day.
In your books?
In my books. But in reality, I think if this war comes, this energy, as I've described it.
Do we have a savior in real life?
Boy, I wish there was. I don't know of anybody because if it comes, it's going to be short, sharp, and not so sweet, and they're going to win, at least in the short term. I mean, so okay, George. Let's say what I'm just predicting is true. Let's say a couple of nukes get taken out, a few insulators are shot off, and you're a dozen or 100. A couple, 2 or 3 transformers are taken out, and
power's out for a few months.
Just power's out all over the place.
Yeah.
It could be like a storm. It's 70 million people without power, and we're going to try to get it all back
as fast as we can.
It could be 3 years with these transformers. Okay, so now this has happened, and it all happened over, let's say, a 2 or 3 or 4 day period, really coordinated, just bang, bang, bang. And the coordinators of it are going to be, of course, Venezuela and Iran, which can be pretty tough to prove. So what do? I mean, do we go nuke Caracas? Do we go nuke Tehran? Do we put boots in the ground there? How do we fight back at this?
That's the problem.
We don't.
In the old days with traditional war, David, as you know, you knew the enemy.
Yes. Well, even Don Rumsfeld said that at a press conference right after 9/11. He said, and they were asked a question: why don't we fight back? And how could they attack us? And Rumsfeld says, for all our nuclear weapons and submarines and missiles, not one of them could have prevented this attack.
That's true.
I'm doing a cautionary. I'm trying to be a cautionary.
All right, hold on for a second, David. We're at another bottom point. We'll be right back. Well, next hour, we'll take your phone calls with David Hagberg. You've heard what we've been talking about, and we'll be back with him with more on Coast to Coast AM. David, as we talk about the abyss, which is this fictional story that could become fact, let me ask you this, too, as well. The only thing that we disagree on is I believe in the abiotic oil theory, that this planet, though we don't have to use oil, has an abundance of it. You think it'll run out in 100 years. I think it could probably last until the end of time. Doesn't mean we should be using it, but that's the only thing we differ on.
Yeah, and oil. Okay, even if you're right, let's say you are right, George, and I guess the jury's still out on that. Oil is way too precious just to burn to run cars.
Oh, I agree.
Because you know what aspirin is made out of?
Partly oil.
Yeah, and all the pharmaceuticals and fabrics and things that we haven't even dreamed of yet, and lubrication. I mean, it's just incredibly stupid just to burn it to run. Even the Navy, the U.S. Navy, runs a lot of their big ships, of course, nuclear power. But now they're trying to run the smaller ships on biomass fuel, something from soybeans or whatever, that
ethanol and stuff like that.
Yeah, stuff like that. And they're doing that experiment because they realize too that, and their jet airplanes running kerosene, Kerojet. If we got into a protracted war, which is not likely to happen, it's going to be short and sweet, we could be vulnerable. Our oil supplies could be vulnerable, and then we need to run airplanes and ships. So they're trying to get away. Now, that's one thing that's right, that we're doing something. We're doing something preventative. I think that the government should control derivatives, and again, rather than 7 times the known oil reserves, hold it down to 1. That's all you can. Just whatever oil is there, you can have derivative positions on that, and that's it. You can't do any more.
Right.
The same way with the housing bubble. Had there been some decent regulation, of course, a $200,000 house is not worth $500,000. Of course, it's not. So some poor couple, they buy this house. The bank's going to give them money, obviously more money than the house is worth, like the derivatives, because everybody believes, well, a young, nice couple will barely move in and they'll sell it for $750,000.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, it didn't work. So that's one preventative measure. Another one. Well, we'll go back up. You asked about Abyss. Abyss is book 1 of probably going to end up 5 books about this energy wars, and it's the opening shot. I've got this NOAA scientist who's figured out a way of putting impellers, not propellers, but impellers that look like more or less shaped like the agitator in a top-loading washing machine. That's really true. That Pax Scientific out in California has invented this thing. But this gal is going to put these big impellers on the ocean floor off the coast of California, Florida, and they will use the Gulf Stream, the Humboldt Current, to turn these
turbines
to produce electricity, which will be shipped back by cable ashore, plugged into this antiquated grid. And when she finds out, if you put enough of these, and they're deep under the water, so not any hazardous shipping. If we put enough of those down there, she'll not only produce all the electricity we need, but these things will change how temperature is distributed from the mid-Atlantic north. And
it's endless. It's endless fuel, isn't it?
Endless fuel, and I think it's like 1,000 times the world's energy needs could be produced in one day, just out of the Gulf Stream. But the plus benefit, which was surprising to me at the time when it came up, is that if these are going to change how much energy is pushed from one end of the Gulf Stream to the other. And that will has a potential to reduce the temperature of the mid-Atlantic by maybe a half a degree or maybe a degree. If that were the case, there still would be tropical storms, but hurricanes would never form.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so she's come up with this. These derivative guys and all that say, no, we can't allow that to happen because all of a sudden we'd have all this free, cheap electricity. So the opening shot is somebody sabotaging a nuclear power station off the in Florida, and it's pretty easy to do.
And then it's the old adage, who benefits, right?
Yeah, who benefits, and that's to the money guys benefit. And it works except for the fact that Kirk McGarvey comes in and he doesn't stop the thing, but he sort of mitigates it. He tamps it down. So this war's on. Now they try to sabotage this woman and kill her, and she wins the Nobel Prize. And I'm not going to give out the ending, but that's just book one. Another book, the next one coming out, is called Blowout, and it's about. Okay, let's back up a second. If we go ahead and go forth with all these alternative energy projects, but not like windmills. I mean, on a big, huge, multi-billion-dollar scale, and we're really pushing fast to get clean, cheap electricity now, real soon. That's when people are going to fight back. Well, the same thing happened in World War II, that the war wasn't going all that well, so Einstein went to Roosevelt and said, look, we can make a powerful new bomb with some of the work I've done. And so Roosevelt said, okay, we're going to do this in secret. It's called the Manhattan District Project, and they developed in a few years nuclear weapons, which ended World War II. In fact, it ended World War as we know it. So the president now, in the next book, has invented or came up with a top-secret project called the Dakota Initiative. And this is science that I've only tweaked a little bit. We find out in Wyoming they're injecting microbes into coal seams, into coal veins. And the microbes, this kind of microbe, there's several hundred variety of them. They eat the coal, and they excrete methane. Well, you can pump the methane up, and you can burn the methane to heat water to produce electricity. And burning methane is a lot cleaner from carbon dioxide than coal. So now back up one more bit of science. The microbes, we have about 600 different varieties of microbes in a human mouth. And the microbes, each of them speak a different language, but they have learned to talk a common language, a lingua franca, and the purpose of that language is that they all work together to produce dental plaque. Honest to God, I didn't make this up. So now I've got the CDC scientist who has learned how you put microbes into a coal seam, and the problem in Wyoming is they eat the coal, they produce methane, and they're so tired they don't reproduce and they die and the methane stops. Well, this scientist has found a way to talk to the microbes and teach them a common language that here's what you're going to do, guys. You're going to eat coal, you're going to produce methane, and you're going to be happy. You're going to be happy, and you're going to reproduce. And so instantly we get methane, and when you can clean that up too, we get methane to burn. And the same guys, in this case, as Venezuela, is their CBN, their Secret Service. They mount several attacks on this. It's called the Dakota Initiative, and the project is out in the Badlands of North Dakota, just like the Manhattan District Project was in a remote section of New Mexico. And the fight is on. That's the next step, the next shot. And then the next shot after that is the book I'm working on, which I tackle the grid.
Which could be the biggest problem, I think.
Which is going to be the biggest problem. So we regulate, do some firm regulation, federal regulation of derivatives. We buy these transformers and stockpile them, either that or manufacture the things ourselves and stockpile them so that we're not vulnerable to that.
Why don't we make them? Did we ever?
No. So far as I know, this is a specialized kind of, maybe Siemens makes them or something in Germany. I'm not quite sure. But no, we never did. And they're a specialized thing. And you don't use a lot of them.
So it's not like a job we lost or anything like that?
No, it's not like a job we lost. So we don't use a lot of the things. I don't know, several hundred probably in the country.
Well, and I would guess that when they work really well and last a long time.
it lasts a long time. There has to be. They don't particularly wear it. They're not a thing like a light bulb that you change from time to time. But you build a new power station, and you have to get several of these transformers. And how many power stations have come online in the last 10 years? Not a lot.
Not a lot.
So it's a real highly specialized. So I think it should be a national goal to either stockpile these things or build the things and stockpile. Keep it here. We need another Manhattan District project to produce, to come up with a source of cheap electricity, but in top secret. It could be happening right now in top secret, because if the word gets out, then the squeeze is going to be on right away, and that's going to make you're going to be spending $25 to $30 a gallon for oil, for gasoline.
Well, you do that, you have no economy anymore.
Yeah, it would really. It would really, but I hadn't heard that intriguing notion of yours, though, that we have unlimited oil yet to be discovered. I got to look at that one.
See, I believe a long time ago, a scientist by the name of Thomas Gold came up with a theory. A number of Russian scientists also believe it, that the planet as it was forming had an abundance of methane and this fuel. It
methane,
doesn't.
I agree with you. Methane, I agree.
Doesn't come, they say, from fossils or dead plants or anything like that. So their theory was that the planet has an abundance. I interviewed a guy years ago, David, who believed that the oil under the ocean floor was enough to last over 100,000 years, he said.
I agree. Not oil, but I agree. There's on the bottom, on the ocean floor, is hydrates of methane. It's essentially methane gas which was abundant. A couple of billion years ago, a few billion years ago, and under the great pressure, under great ocean depth pressure, and the temperatures, it's like ice. And that would be enough to fuel, if we could safely get it up, that would be enough to fuel this planet for probably the next 5 billion years. Yeah. So you're right in that. The problem is, and here we didn't even mention this before, because with global warming, especially in the Arctic, where the ice cap is melting, sooner or later that's going to begin to release this methane hydrates. And that's the problem I discussed in this book, too. Methane is cleaner burning, but if raw methane gas gets into our atmosphere, it's going to be a bajillion times, I don't know if that's a real number, but it's going to be a bajillion times worse to our climate than carbon dioxide. And the problem, and nobody knows how to solve it, because one of the unintended consequences of global warming will be the release of lots and lots of methane, a massive dump of methane into our atmosphere. Well, again, it takes 100,000 years for the planet to clean up itself, starting with an ice age, to lock everything back in place. So yes, you are right, absolutely right. There's enough fuel, if we know how to use it and extract it safely, laying around to power us for forever. Now, is it practical?
Well, that's the issue.
And you got the derivative guy. Look, I'm making $1 bajillion. I love bajillion. That's one of my favorite words. I'm making $1 bajillion a year in oil derivatives. I don't want that to change. I don't give a damn about methane hydrates. And I don't care about wind power. I don't care about this stuff. I want the status quo to stay the same.
Well, and you also let the world think that you're going to run out. The peak oil theory.
Yeah.
Much like De Beers does with the diamonds, they hold them back. If every diamond that's on this planet was released to the public, the prices would plummet.
And women at the altar would be very, very mad.
Yes, they would. So would the guys be who had the pay for.
So would the guy. But no, see now, George, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's showing that how tremendously complicated and interlocking this whole thing is. And so wars can be started if you just, the system is all working. If you tweak one little thing or pull one little card out of this house of cards, it could be the one card that causes the whole thing to fall.
Sure.
And I'm thinking oil derivatives, which are the bad guys, my bad guys. But I've always got Kurt McGarvey. Kurt McGarvey's going to save the day.
In your book.
In my book.
We don't have a Kurt McGarvey here.
Maybe we do. I don't know.
I don't know where he is.
I talked to some people at FBI, the Cyber Crimes Unit, and they're very practical, down-to-earth people, but they have some pretty neat ideas, like this virus in our electrical grid system, and they don't particularly publicize the stuff they do. Although a friend over at the CIA told me, I said, "You guys sure dropped the ball on 9/11." He said, "We sure did, David." But he said, for every 9/11 that we miss, we stop 1,000.
Yeah, that we don't hear about, probably.
Yeah, and he said, and if we tell you about it, then the cat's out of the bag, and then it gives a blueprint for the next guy to say. See, you asked a question too earlier, George, that you hope that the things that I imagine and write about, that some terrorist out there says, "Oh, Hagberg wrote about this. We could do this."
Yeah.
I did a book a while back, High Flight, in which, this was well before 9/11, in which our air traffic control system was sabotaged in such a way that it would cause airlines to have problems. The airliners would fall out of the sky, would crash. And in fact, on one day at precisely, I think, 3:58 p.m. Eastern Time, 13 airliners did crash, and so it was crashing airliners. But I got this from, I can't remember the guy's name now. It's been 10, 11 years. But he was the head air traffic control instructor and designer of the system. And they were doing a big program up in Minneapolis. And I went up to talk to him. I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, "Sure, that's easy." And he took me step by step how to sabotage our air control system. And it's pretty easy. He just asked one thing. He said, "David, don't write it exactly that way. Change things so that what you're saying will not be a blueprint for somebody to say, okay, Hagberg says do it this way, and then we're going to go do it." So all my attacks in my books that McGarvey solves could be done, but not quite that way. I've changed things around. I've changed the layout of a nuclear power plant so that it's not quite that way.
You had mentioned... Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Although what I start out with is the truth about these transformers and the vulnerability of the grid. I can't get away from that. So in my book, my guy is going to go back to the source and be Iran and Venezuela, not as the United States attacking these countries, but my guy, McGarvey, individually will go after. As a matter of fact, it'll all end up with this super hacker, computer hacker in Amsterdam, who's got a copy of the virus, and he's the one pushing the button, and McGarvey will take him out, and that solves that particular problem.
You had asked about water wars.
Yeah, that's going to come next. I'm just starting on that. That's give me several books down the line because I'm just starting research. Come to find out that Pakistan gets virtually all of its water from snow melt out of the Himalayas. Right?
Once that snow goes, they're screwed.
Once that snow, and it's already going, it's already diminishing. India controls that water, and India and Pakistan are not pals. So India starts turning the faucet down because they need it for their own uses, and Pakistan's got nuclear weapons. They're going to fight back. Water is a heck of a lot more important than plain ordinary old energy.
I don't know why we don't put in massive water desalination plants.
Well, it's going to be easier now. My wife and I lived in the U.S. Virgin Islands for a couple of years. Excuse me. And there's no fresh water, there's no wells or anything on that island. And so by law, and this has been law now, but ever since people settled the Virgin Islands, long before desalination plants are possible, and it's in the tropics, so it rains quite a bit during the rainy season. They just have the drain gutters. The water rolls off the roof down a drain gutter, and they put, like we'd call a basement.
Yeah, they collect the water. Hey, David, hold on. We're coming back with some phone calls with you on Coast to Coast AM. Well, can this happen? Maybe. Let's take your phone calls with David Hagberg when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. David, would the water wars be started when a nation would say, we don't have water, you do, and we're going to take it?
Yes, but probably more complicated than that. Probably more like the India-Pakistan, because rivers tend to not care much about international borders.
Right.
And so anybody downstream could be out of luck. because the people at the source are going to take the water, whatever they need. And if there's anything left over, there's a big flat between Georgia and Florida. Water flowing somewhere out of a lake in Georgia. When Atlanta was having the big drought a year or two ago, they started cutting the spigots and started limiting the flow across the border of Florida. Well, we jumped up and down and said, there's salt marsh estuaries that there's certain species of animals or fish or whatever, or crabs, that need a certain amount of fresh water, and they weren't getting it. And so the fight came down to who was more important, the estuary crabs in Florida, I'm simplifying it, or people in Atlanta. And they actually compromised between people and crabs. So it's complicated. But when the faucet begins to run dry, people will fight over it. Even more importantly than energy. I mean, push comes to shove, we can always walk or get bicycles, but without water, we're sunk.
Well, that's true. There's no doubt about that. Let's take some phone calls here for you. Let's go to Roy in Rupert, Georgia. Let's get us going. Hey, Roy, thanks.
Yes, sir. Mr. Noory, you brought to Mr. Hagberg's attention a fact about, let's call it anti-peak oil. It's the expression peak oil. You're hearing now the expression peak oxygen. Dr. With a gentleman that broadcasts 15 hours a week, 59-year-old doc. Anyway, sir, Mr. Hagberg was talking about the energy from the Gulf Stream. There is no Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream, also known as a loop current, and I heard him using, I think, another word. There's about 5. I don't know how many words that use for expressions they use for Gulf Stream, but there is no Gulf Stream anymore, sir. 29 degrees in UK last winter, first time in 1,000 years. Blowout of the oil drilling well, and it was known you should not drill oil through a salt dome, and the destruction is MI6, I guess. Anyway, go ahead and put the damn oil well then through the salt dome and destroyed the ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico, with the counterclockwise currents coming on the ocean from from the eastern hemisphere to the western hemisphere, and circling around and going up around the peninsula of Florida, all the way up the east coast, across the North Atlantic, and bathing Europe in warm currents. And now we are in for crop failures, along with 2012 and planetary alignments, 26,500 miles.
Roy, do we have a question here?
The question is, with energy, they're deriving energy from the Gulf Stream. There is no Gulf Stream, and also you brought to his attention about anti-peak oil. There's no peak oil either. The Russians have
I still haven't heard your question.
The question is, so that throws out that source of energy, and I'm looking at a map here of Pakistan, and I'm sure why they carved out Pakistan is that countless rivers.
I still haven't heard your question, and I got 1,000 people on hold here that want to get through. But what's your thoughts about him? He is saying that the Gulf Stream has stopped.
Well, there are fluctuations, but I think the 29-degree temperature in Plymouth in southern England is just, maybe it didn't happen 1,000 years, but things are happening. Global warming has unintended consequences. But as far as I know, if the Gulf Stream stopped, there'd be all sorts of things happening more than 29 degrees in England. And people I know over at NOAA, you'd be reading about this all over the place because it's way too important. You can tell where the Gulf Stream is. I've sailed across it. You dip a thermometer in the water, and when you hit the Gulf Stream, it's like within 10 feet, the temperature climbs about 2 or 3 degrees. And people going to the Bahamas, if the Gulf Stream wasn't going north at 2.5 or 3 knots, and it stopped, and you compensated for that current to try to sail to the Bahamas, you'd miss the Bahamas. And I have sailing friends, and nobody's mentioned that to me. So I'll look into it, but I don't think that's right.
Well, here's another idea for your novel, this story on the abiotic oil theory. Picture this, a group of oil executives from different companies in a clandestine meeting, David. And,
I love it already.
And they say, look, we know that this planet has an abundance of oil. We need to convince the public that there's a finite limit to it. Okay. And then your hero goes off to do what he does. There you go. You got to win it. Gleason will love that.
Yeah, I know Gleason well. He's a good guy.
Let's go east of the Rockies. Barbara in Alexander, North Carolina.
Thank you,
Sure,
George. I've been waiting for 2 years to get through. I have so many things that I wanted to put forth about the alternative energy.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing, about 5 years ago, some of us in our area received a letter about an alternative source of energy, which was a little box that we could put on our porch, and we would have all the energy that we wanted, and then we would sell the rest of it to the grid. Well, we were interested, and some of us wrote back, and I think it was going to cost about $1,000. And it said it wasn't harmful or anything, and we could sell it back to the grid. And all of a sudden, it was all hushed up, and we never heard of it again. And then there was Billy, I've forgotten his last name, that had the contact with the aliens.
Billy Meyer.
Yeah, Billy Meyer, and all of a sudden he developed this car that ran on a gallon of water all across the nation, didn't he? And that was hushed up. And then there was the man who had the alternative.
Well, look what they did to Tesla.
Yeah, the alternative that where. Now let's see. I about lost my thread here. I'm sorry.
Well, let's get some comments about David, the conspiracy behind these things. When people do come up with alternative forms of energy, they either get bought out or they get muffled.
I'm going to say yes and no to you because, yes, if there's anything that seems to hurt the status quo, as we talk about, it's all about money. This is about money. It always has been. Then, yes, they'll be bought out and be hushed up because if I can make more of a profit off this little box, and I think I know what she's talking about, is cold fusion. If I can make more money developing that than I can in oil derivatives, then I'll say, the heck with oil derivatives, I'll do the little box thing. And if I can't, I'll buy it and I'll hush it up. That's very common. But also, that's the yes. The no is we're filled with urban myths. And my wife was going to buy into one. It was a big ad in the paper the other day or a couple of weeks ago about an air conditioning system, an air conditioner that is in the house. You just plug it in. It doesn't have to be, a vent outside. You just plug it in next to the couch and you got air-conditioned air. And I said, that's impossible. What it does, an air conditioner takes in room air, it cools it down. And that heat that it takes out of that air, it has to go someplace, so you vent it outside. If this air conditioner was just in the room, you'd take the room air in, you'd cool it down, and the heat would have to go somewhere, right back in the room. So it's a zero-sum game. So I'm saying yes and no to both of you that there are urban myths out there about cars running across U.S. on using water. Sure, we can break down water into hydrogen and oxygen and then reburn it, but it takes energy to break the water down to hydrogen and oxygen. But yes, I totally agree. The money men, these are the people, money men and women. These are the people who control. He or she who controls the purse strings controls just about everything. And you were right about Tesla. They jumped on that poor guy, and he was probably one of the most genius engineers in the last 100 years.
I think he would have been pulling energy out of the atmosphere for free, but they didn't want that.
Nothing's for free. But we would have been further along, like the big argument between Edison and Westinghouse, and Westinghouse won producing electricity. Edison wanted to use direct current, and Westinghouse says, no, it's easier to use alternating current, and there were big battles, and AC won. Remember the beta tape versus the
VHS?
DVD? Yeah. So it ain't always the best that wins, but it's usually the people with the purse strings. And I'm not anti-rich, trust me. I'm just saying that your guys meeting in a boardroom is not too far from the truth. It's probably right on.
What do you think of the possibilities of an electronic pulse weapon exploded over the United States by an Iran to knock out the grid that way too?
That'll work. What's even more dangerous to us is consider that our lives are almost totally dependent upon satellites and satellite communications. Well, China did an experiment. They sent up a rocket, I don't know how long ago, it wasn't too long ago, and they blew what they said was a defunct satellite out of orbit. And that's a bunch of luck. They may have done that, but the whole idea was, and because they had a real heavy lifting rocket to go up there, a lot bigger rocket than, let's say, it would only take them 5 pounds of explosive to knock out that satellite. But they sent up a heavy lifting rocket that was heavy enough to lift a hydrogen bomb up in orbit. And all you have to do is go into orbit, in the same orbit most satellites run in, blow a nuclear weapon, a hydrogen weapon, and that electromagnetic pulse is going to wipe out all our satellites. It'll just kill them all. And then we would truly be stuck.
Next up, let's go to Sabrina in New York. Welcome to the program. Hi, Sabrina.
Oh, hi. Good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I had two quick things to say, one of which is a question.
Okay.
First, about 2 years ago, when I still had an analog TV set, I used to periodically see words flash on it very, very quickly, a megasecond. And once when they were doing something about the war in Iran, they were showing a picture, like a really heavy-duty combat picture that they normally did not show. And the word Iran flashed over it. It was a story about Iraq. I don't know if I said that correctly. It was a story about Iraq, and then the word Iran flashed over it very, very quickly.
Subliminal?
Yeah, I believe so, and I believe I was able to see it because I still had this analog TV set. What I wanted to ask, though, is, okay, Israel is talking about bombing nuclear facilities. Is that not the height of insanity? Would that not release an awful lot of radiation, totally uncontrolled? They're talking about bombing facilities that they say that they don't really understand what they're used for. They suspect they're used for, nefarious purposes, and they say they want to bomb them. That's the height of self-destruction.
What do you think of that, David? Can that happen?
Oh, not really. They're not going to. The whole idea is you're not going to bomb, say, a nuclear reactor or something like that. You're going to wipe out the machinery that produces this. You can do the same thing by just wiping out the electrical generating plant, let's say, that produces electricity that goes into the facility to do nuclear research. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the first uranium was processed, you can wipe out all sorts of equipment without releasing any radiation. And anyway, some of the thinking is, and so I have to agree with this lady in some ways, some of the thinking that Israelis would have, and I'm not trying to put words in their mouth, but if they, depending upon the wind conditions, I don't know that right now, but if they say, okay, we bomb and there's a release of nuclear materials, they may just say, so what? As long as it stays in Iran. All the big nuclear problems after the tsunami in Japan, there was no great big spike in nuclear problems around the world because most of that stuff was pretty well confined to Japan or the nearby waters. So I have a feeling that if it came to that and Israel actually did it, they would do it on a day where the winds weren't blowing their way and say, tough luck, Iran, you shouldn't have meddled with this to begin with.
Will this planet, David,
cold.
will this planet ever get along with each other?
Oh, when I was a kid or a teenager reading philosophies, you talked about the United Nations has come under a lot of fire, and I thought to myself, this is going to be some sort of a world government where we could all get together. And my wife and I go to New York 3 times or 4 times a year. We always stay at the Grand Hyatt, which is in walking distance to the UN, and we walk down there. We go like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and so Sunday morning after breakfast we walk down to the UN and kind of look around. The grounds are beautiful. Go into the General Assembly building, and there's
security heavy.
No, there's some cops out there, but no, it's generally not. And my wife said, "This is almost like church to you, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "The idea of this, at least the notion of it, could be world peace, but who knows? We're not going to have an all-out nuclear war anymore, a world war anymore, because mutual assured destruction stopped that, and we weren't insane enough. But we're going to have these energy wars and water wars." I'm painting a bleak picture, guys.
You are. Tell me something nice. Can't you talk about a love story?
Yeah, I'm going to start writing love stories. But there are love stories, as a side story. And lately, because my daughter and my wife were jumping on me about that I didn't have strong women characters. All I had was little wimpy women that men had to save. And so now, in the last 4, 5, 6 books, I've had strong women characters, sometimes flawed, like all of us, but strong. And so there is usually a love angle there. I try.
Well, let's go to Colorado
Springs. The world as I see it.
Hey, Rich, go ahead. Rich, you with us?
Springs, Colorado, Rich?
Yep, go ahead.
I'll tell you, George, you had a guest not too long ago who was a double agent in Iran, and he spoke about the fact that mutually assured destruction means nothing to those people because in the really, really deep-rooted Islamic tradition, they honestly believe that it's their job to bring about the end of the world. And
which is why we don't want them to have nuclear weapons, because they don't believe in the idea of MAD, and so the critics say, well, look, we're being hypocritical. U.S. has got nuclear weapons, France does, Russia does, China does. So why should we stop North Korea and Iran from having nuclear weapons?
We all adhere to mutually assured destruction,
and they don't.
Guys don't. And they've got this biblical, or not biblical, but Quranic belief that it's their job to bring about the end of the world. They get their 76 Vestal virgins and a personal invite to sit down and eat dinner with Allah, I guess.
And that's why we have to do everything within our power not to let these guys have nuclear weapons. Because once they do, man, it's tough. They'd have it, and North Koreans have it, and that's a real political issue. If they had a few hundred of them and some really heavy-duty missiles that would reach Washington and New York, I think things would be different.
I think so, too. David, hold on. We're going to come back with our final break with you on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, who is Alex Jones? What makes him tick? He'll be on the program, and we'll find out. We'll come back in a moment with David Hagberg and talk final phone calls on Coast to Coast AM. David, how strong do you think our cyber command is? I mean, is it a powerful organization? Can they fight off just about anything?
Yes, but like that virus that they know is on our control centers for the grid, they have not, so far as last I've heard, they've been unable to do anything about it, and everybody's just sort of holding their breath. But I think it's like anything in computers; it's getting better and better, and exponentially, our computers are getting faster and faster, and more sophisticated, and these guys are some of the brightest minds. Over at the CIA, there are more PhDs per capita at the CIA than there are at Harvard.
I believe it.
There's some really bright people working on this.
Now, have we dumped the system in the Russians and the Chinese grids?
Well, it wouldn't work so much because they have national grids that are hardened because the government runs them. Ours is not government run or controlled, and there's dozens of different companies all working some at odds with each other.
Well,
so we don't have a system that we can harden.
Some of them are publicly held and everything else, aren't they?
Some are publicly held. A lot of them are privately held. The whole business, the business of transmitting power from one end of the country to the other, is taken out of the hands of the people who produced the power long, long ago. But nobody has ever, organized it. The government needs to organize it. Almost every other country is nationalized.
Let's go to Jim, truck driving in Connecticut. Welcome to the program. Hi, Jim.
Hey, how you doing, George?
Okay.
Long time no talk to.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, they can make oil. I heard from a guy that's a professor. They can make oil in the laboratory from turkey guts in 30 minutes. I was just wondering what your guest David thought about that.
Turkey guts. Well, there was a plant in Carthage, Missouri. I don't know if it's still running or not, David, but it got fuel from turkey remains.
Yeah, you can make burnable fuel from just about anything. There's some guys running around buying used cooking oil from McDonald's, and they run their car, their diesels on it.
That's right.
The problem isn't producing, making that kind of oil in the lab. The problem is producing enough. I think we use about 20 million barrels of gasoline a day just in this country alone. And a barrel is 42 gallons, I think. That's a lot of gasoline. You'd have to have a lot of turkey guts to do that. Same way if we switched our cars and trucks to ethanol, just ethanol, which we make from corn. Every plantable acre of land in the entire world would have to grow nothing but corn just to produce ethanol. That's how big this stuff is. So, yeah, you can produce oil from a burnable fuel of one kind or another from just about anything. I'll tell you one, these garbage dumps, these big mounds you see across the side of those, when they decompose, they produce methane. There's a few places around the United States where the methane is pumped out of the garbage disposal areas, and they use it to produce electricity locally, but not enough. But there are some farms in the Midwest where you use methane from belching cattle in the barn,
right.
Belching cattle, and they use that. They can burn that too, but not on the quantities that we actually use every day.
All right, back to the phones we go. Let's go to Hutchinson, Kansas. Jeff's with us east of the Rockies. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning to you, too.
I had a question. First, George, we did have the Siemens moved into town here, a little town of 40,000. They built a huge plant to build nacelles for the windmills, and they're going to employ eventually over 400 people.
400, that's a lot.
Cool.
They have a plant in Iowa that makes the blades, and this is the guts, the generator part that they're going to build. But anyway, we're doing a lot of talking here because we have the gigantic aquifer that's underground that runs from Kansas through Oklahoma down to Texas, I think some into New Mexico. That's the water source. And now the great guns have figured out that they want to put in a pipeline from Canada to the U.S. running all the way down through these states. And this pipeline runs right through the eastern boundary of the aquifer. And you were talking about the terrorist earlier. I was wondering what your guest felt about that pipeline and how vulnerable it would be, since it's sitting underground, but it would be right on top of the aquifer.
But see, we're filled with very, very vulnerable systems like pipelines across the Alaskan tundra.
Yeah.
This pipeline is a hell of a lot more important going across drinking water. And yes, this stuff is vulnerable. Our power lines are vulnerable. It's just, well, our airlines were vulnerable, and now we get the TSA that everybody complains about, but there's been no hijacking, since that. Yeah, we live in a vulnerable country. The problem is we have this freedom of speech, freedom of movement. You don't have to have a passport to drive from, let's say, Iowa to Montana. And with all that freedom, hell, I can go on the internet and figure out and look up how to build a nuclear weapon, and it's all there. How to build explosives, and it's all. And that's the downside of a totally open and free society. It's extremely vulnerable. I would worry about it.
Why aren't the Iranians smarter, David? Why don't they recognize Israel and stop the rhetoric about saying we're going to blow them off the face of the map?
You know, it's a religious thing that they've painted themselves in a corner. You know, that first war in '47, when the United Nations recognized Israel as a country and the Arabs attacked them, said, it's just a little teeny country, we're going to wipe them off the face of the earth. But these were folks who survived the Holocaust, who survived Auschwitz and all that, and they said, we're going to fight until we die, and they bloodied the Arabs' noses. And now it's I don't want to get into religion versus religion because not all Muslims are obviously bad. All of them are terrorists. But they've backed themselves into a religious corner, and they can't really get out without making total fools of themselves. I think if that government fell, like in the Arab Spring, and we got more of a democracy, things might change. I mean, Egypt recognized Israel, and so things are possible. You guys are asking for world peace, and you want me to tell you it's coming down the pike. I wish I could.
You don't feel it?
Nah. Well, again, this is terrible. The conditions on the planet are terrible for people, me included, but they're wonderful for storytellers, for novelists.
Idaho Falls, Idaho. Norman, it's your turn. Go ahead, Norman.
Yes, thanks for taking my call.
My
I was
pleasure.
just wondering if you had heard about thorium. The Idaho National Laboratory, that is west of Idaho Falls, is working with it, and there was a large deposit discovered near Salmon, Idaho. Secondly, have you ever heard of John Revelator's prophecy that states that there will be an explosion in the Tigris River, and which a prophet will rise, there will be one prophet, one faith, and any who oppose him will be put to the sword?
No, I hadn't heard that one. I've heard similar. I've heard similar things like that, or predictions or whatever. Not that one in particular.
Are you an end times type person, David?
No. Yeah, Bob Gleason is our editor.
He is.
Yeah, I think that even if let's say, even with this runaway carbon dioxide and global warming, it's not going to wipe out humankind as a species. It's not going to be what this Aztec 2012 calendar. It would certainly drastically change our lives, maybe all the way back to the Stone Ages. But we're too. Maybe I'm being a Pollyanna here, but we're way, way too resilient. I guess we're about the only species ever on the planet that's been able to alter our environments, and I think that's going to stay that way. I don't think we're going to get wiped out. I don't think had there been a worldwide nuclear war, like Carl Sagan said, a nuclear winter, I don't think all of human life would be wiped out. I think the only thing that would cause that is one of these an asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, and even that might
or a volcano, a huge volcano eruption.
Yeah, even that I don't think we would figure out a way with bunkers or whatever. We're too versatile a species. So as far as world peace goes, no, we're a long ways from it. But as far as our destruction go, as a human beings, no, that's not even close. We're better than that.
Let's go to William. He's driving in California. Hi, William.
Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hey, first off, I forgot about something I was going to say. I think, in a way, George is right about oil, but I think it's actually derived from compressed aged gas, like methane gas. It's converted like diamonds and coal and whatnot. That's my theory, although there's a lot of gas out here. I don't think it's infinite, especially if we keep growing the way we are. So I think there is limitations. But what I called about is a couple things. One, I think you guys are right. If you can't make a ton of money, if a corporation can't get behind it, you don't really hear about it a lot because I have ADD and I go on the internet and kind of research trippy things a lot. And I've seen stuff like a car in Austria that's manufactured that gets 150 miles to the gallon. And I've seen also stuff here in America, like, and I don't know this guy personally, but he's in Texas, and he can make water out of air and electricity out of water. I think it's droughtmasters.com, I think is the website. But there are things out there.
And what about the compressed air car from India? That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You guys, but the point is of all these things, yes, let's just take one thing. We can break down water into hydrogen and oxygen, right? And then we can burn, hydrogen will burn in the presence of oxygen. So we'll burn the hydrogen and turn it back to water. But it's a losing proposition because it takes more energy of some kind to break the water down into hydrogen and oxygen than you're going to get when you burn. Something has to lose. Then when you burn the hydrogen and oxygen back for energy, you're going to get less energy than it took to break down the hydrogen and oxygen to begin with, unless we can do it with solar power. And so these things, they all work. All this stuff is really great. There's a car that looks like a hot dog on wheels, real low slung, carries 2 people. They get, what was I reading the other day? They get 1,200 or 1,300 miles to a gallon. But it's not something you and the family to work. It's extremely aerodynamic. One person sort of lays in the thing. And so, yes, all this stuff is possible, but none of it's practical on the scale we need.
Fort St. Lucie, Florida, we have Joshua waiting. Go ahead, Josh.
Hey there. I was asking, what is your opinion on the Occupy movement, this lovely rebellion against the status quo we call the Occupy?
Have you looked at it, David? Occupied Group?
Occupied? No, I don't know what Occupied Group. I had misheard them. I don't know. Tell me more.
Well, now, you've heard of these groups that are all over Occupy Wall Street.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking terrorist organizations in Iran or something. So
no, they're not terrorists.
No, absolutely
far
not.
from it.
And I think, and by the way, I used to live in Vero Beach, not too far from St. Lucie. No, I think it's wonderful. Again, we have freedom of speech and assembly and all that in this, and that's guaranteed in our Constitution. My only problem with the group is, what are they protesting? They have no agenda. If I'm going to protest something, I'm going to say, look, I don't want pig farms within 50 miles of my house. And a bunch of people agree with me, and we're going to get together and we're going to protest at the USDA or whatever. Or I think one of the protests should be, if there's a government bailout of some big bank or financial institution, they should cap the amount of compensation the CEO gets. I mean, who was just a recent company, the CEO they hired, some woman, she failed. She was there 9 months, and she failed, and the company was maybe a Kodak or something. They gave her a going-away package of $27 million. That's nuts.
That's failure?
So that's what I think. This Occupy group, the 99%ers, that's what they should go, a specific thing. Because Congress is listening. Get Congress to cap compensation. They'll fight. The companies will fight back.
Look, they just gave bonuses to the executives of Fannie and Freddie Mae, right? The home mortgage companies, part of the United States government. They're losing billions a quarter, and they give these people $12 million in bonuses.
Well, their argument comes, I'm a Libra, so I see both sides of that, almost every issue. Their argument is, unless we offer these bonuses, we're not going to get the brightest minds. Well, if these are the brightest minds...
maybe the dumb people would lose more. Who knows, right?
Yeah, like you and I and the truck drivers. Remember that song of John Denver, Late Night Radio, Take It Everywhere It Goes? Best friend when I love that song. We should run the show. We couldn't do any worse.
Let's go to Dan, Colorado Springs, Colorado, first-time caller. Hi, Dan.
Yes, thank you for taking my call, George.
Sure, thank you.
One of the questions I have regarding the 2 buildings that were struck by the airplanes, and you guys seem to think that, or your guests seem to think the gasoline brought the buildings down. And I wonder, have you ever heard of 0-point energy?
Well, you know I have.
Okay. No, I haven't. Tell me about a 0-point energy.
A comment I made by an expert on 0-point energy was that the buildings, when they collapsed, they disintegrated.
Yes, they did. They crumbled.
They didn't fall down in blocks and pieces and chunks and
break off.
They just turned into dust. And we weren't able to find a desk, a chair, anything of any substance.
Oh, but we found a passport of a hijacker.
There you have it. Was it his passport or his driver's license? I forget.
Well, they found human bones in buildings, blocks on the roofs of buildings blocks away.
Oh man, I'll tell you what. Well, that to me says something. And then to have Building 7 actually blow up like a controlled explosion building, the way that Swazo Brothers would do it in Las Vegas or wherever they blow buildings up. They said that to bring those two buildings down the way they came down would be a virtual impossibility unless you had about a year, 2 years to plan it. And he said they said it was just absolutely impossible to see those two buildings come down the way they did in the amount of time that they did. And one other thing I had was this Occupy Wall Street. People are occupying Wall Street because we're occupying a place because we've just witnessed the largest crime in the history of mankind.
I agree.
I don't believe we've ever seen 13, 14, 15 trillion dollars
and they got away with it
the way Wall Street managed to do it.
Poof.
Well, they not only got away with it, they got bonuses. Come on, guys.
Everywhere. David, tell us where we can get the book Abyss.
Abyss is at any bookstore, of course. No longer Borders, unfortunately, but Barnes & Noble. You can get it on Amazon.com and on BarnesandNoble.com. If you go to my website, david-hagberg.com, I've got links to probably 8 or 10 or 12 places to buy the book. And if you just go online, Google David Hagberg, there's like about 800,000 entries or something. Lots of them are especially bookshops all over the world who you can order from online, usually at a nice discount.
Oh, absolutely. Say hi to Bob Gleason for me next time you chat with him.
You doing another book with him?
Couple more down the line.
Oh, fantastic.
Couple more. He's a great editor, isn't he?
Well, he's been my friend for almost 30 years.
He's got that magic red pen. All right, David. Thanks so much. Let's hope that some of your things don't come true, but they have in the past. For Nathan Staton, Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Tim Banal, Stephanie Smith, Ross Mitchell, George Knapp, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Noory. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM, we shall see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.